Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories. Tonight we're going to take our time together. There is no need to rush, no need to hold on to anything tightly. This is a story meant to unfold slowly, the way old ideas do when they're given room to breathe. Before anything else, before the words settle into their rhythm, take a moment to notice where you are. The light in the room, the quiet sounds around you, the simple fact that you are here, listening. If you find this kind of journey calming, if it helps you slow your thoughts and rest more deeply, you can gently support the channel by liking the video or subscribing, but only if it feels right to you. There is no pressure here. We are simply sharing time. What we're exploring tonight is not a story of conquest or power. It is not about beings arriving fully formed, unchanged, and eternal. Instead, it is about what happens after arrival, about what Earth itself does, slowly and without intention, to those who try to remain upon it. The Sumerian texts, when read carefully and without modern expectations imposed upon them, do not describe gods who arrive and stay unchanged forever. They describe a process, a gradual adjustment, and eventually a quiet withdrawal shaped not by defeat, but by endurance. The earliest layers of Sumerian writing do not begin with Earth as a hostile place. They do not open with suffering or struggle. Instead, they assume a world already functioning, already structured, already capable of supporting life. Heaven and earth have been separated. Time moves forward. Cycles exist. Water flows where it should. The texts do not linger on the difficulty of arrival, because arrival itself is not the focus. What matters is what comes after presence becomes sustained. In these records, Earth is not presented as a passive stage. It is not merely a backdrop against which divine actions unfold. It is an active system, a place with weight, with air, with cycles that do not adjust themselves for anyone. The land floods when it floods. The seasons turn when they turn. Bodies must adapt or suffer the consequences. This applies not only to humans, but to the divine figures who dwell here for extended periods. The earliest descriptions of divine beings in Sumerian texts emphasize authority, order, and function. They are named in relation to what they oversee: the sky, the air, the waters beneath the ground. At first, there is little emphasis on limitation. The gods are described as powerful, as capable, as embedded within the structure of the cosmos itself. But as the texts progress, something subtle changes. The language begins to shift. Words associated with needs begin to appear, with rest, with sustenance, with shelter. Earth, as the Sumerians understood it, was not neutral. It imposed conditions. Gravity pulled everything downward. Air had to be breathed, water had to be managed. The land required labour to remain fertile. None of these realities were optional. They were not obstacles designed to punish. They were simply the way the world functioned, and prolonged exposure to these conditions left marks. The Sumerian texts do not describe this process dramatically. There is no sudden collapse, no single moment where the gods are said to weaken or fail. Instead, there is accumulation, a gradual recognition that remaining present requires maintenance. That presence is not effortless. That power alone does not negate the demands of a physical world. Early on, the gods are described as moving freely. They travel between domains, they appear in cities, they interact directly with humans. But over time, the nature of this presence changes. They become more stationary. They dwell in specific places. Temples are established not merely as centres of worship, but as controlled environments, places where conditions can be stabilised, where offerings ensure sustenance, where rituals maintain balance. This shift is not framed as loss of power, it is framed as necessity. Earth demands equilibrium. Bodies, even divine ones as they are described in these texts, require consistency. They require protection from extremes, the heat of the sun, the cold of night, the unpredictability of flood and drought. These are not portrayed as enemies, but they are never portrayed as irrelevant. As the gods remain, their relationship to time begins to change. Time on Earth moves in cycles that do not pause. Days follow nights, seasons follow one another, agricultural rhythms dominate life. Even the divine calendar becomes tied to lunar cycles and solar movements. Festivals are held at specific times. Rituals repeat. Nothing stands still. The longer the gods remain embedded in this system, the more the texts emphasize order and regulation. Authority is no longer exercised through constant physical presence. It is exercised through structure, through delegation, through established roles. Humans are instructed, systems are put in place. The gods oversee rather than act directly. This is where the Anunnaki begin to be described differently, not as newcomers, not as invaders, but as figures whose roles become increasingly administrative. They are associated with judgment, with fate, with decisions that are pronounced rather than enacted. Their presence becomes less physical and more abstract. They are still part of the world, but no longer everywhere within it. Earth does not drive them away. The texts never say this. There is no rebellion of nature, no cosmic rejection. Instead, Earth remains consistent. It continues to impose its conditions. And over time, those conditions shape behavior. The idea that even divine beings must adapt to environment is not stated explicitly, but it is embedded throughout the narrative structure. The need for food is described. Offerings are not symbolic alone. They sustain. The need for rest appears. The gods complain of labour. They express fatigue. They seek relief. These are not metaphors. They are practical concerns within the worldview of the texts. Earth is heavy, not emotionally, physically. Gravity pulls. Bodies age within time. Even long lifespans are measured. Years are counted. Reigns are recorded. The very act of counting implies limitation. It implies duration, and duration implies change. As the narrative moves forward, the gods rely more heavily on humans. Labour is transferred. Maintenance becomes a shared responsibility. The world continues to function, but only because systems have been established to keep it that way. This is not failure, it is adaptation. What the Sumerian texts quietly suggest is that remaining on Earth indefinitely is not effortless, even for beings of great power. The planet does not attack, it does not resist. It simply continues to be what it is, a system with rules that apply to all who dwell within it. This realization does not arrive suddenly. It accumulates over generations of stories, hymns, and records. Presence becomes more formal, interaction becomes ritualized, memory begins to replace direct experience, and yet nothing ends here. There is no conclusion drawn, no final judgment pronounced. The world continues, the gods continue, the relationship changes, but it does not vanish. Earth remains what it has always been, stable, indifferent, unyielding in its quiet consistency. As we move forward, we will look more closely at how this long exposure reshaped the roles of the Anunnaki themselves, how environment influenced authority, how time altered presence, how adaptation replaced dominance, and how withdrawal became not a failure, but a response. For now, the world is still early in its rhythm. The systems are forming. The weight of Earth has only begun to make itself felt. The arrival described in the Sumerian texts is never framed as a dramatic entrance. There are no lights in the sky, no ruptures in the heavens, no moment where the world pauses to acknowledge something extraordinary. Instead, presence is assumed. The gods are simply there, already within a world that is moving, cycling, functioning according to rules that are not newly written for their sake. This is one of the quiet but essential details that often goes unnoticed when the texts are read with modern expectations in mind. Earth does not change to accommodate them. Earth does not prepare itself. It continues. In the earliest layers of Sumerian writing, The world is already structured when divine figures begin to act within it. Heaven and earth have been separated. Water flows where it should. The sun rises and sets. The moon marks time. Seasons exist. There is no suggestion that the planet pauses its processes for new occupants, no implication that gravity lightens or air thickens to suit unfamiliar bodies. Whatever arrives into a system already in motion. This is important because it tells us how the Sumerians understood the relationship between beings and environment. The world is not subordinate. It is not a blank surface waiting to be shaped. It is a reality that must be navigated. The gods do not rewrite Earth's conditions. They learn to live within them. The texts reflect this subtly, through what they choose to describe and what they leave unstated. There are no passages celebrating effortless dominance over nature. Instead, we see attention paid to canals, to floods, to winds, to heat, to cold. The same environmental challenges that define human life in Mesopotamia appear woven into the divine narrative. This suggests a shared exposure, not equality, but participation. When the gods establish themselves on Earth, they do not float above it indefinitely. They dwell in places, they take up residence, they inhabit specific regions and cities. This alone tells us something crucial. To dwell is to remain is to endure. And endurance always involves adaptation. The Sumerian landscape was not forgiving. The flat alluvial plains between the rivers offered fertility, but only with constant management. Floods could enrich the soil or destroy entire settlements. Heat could sustain crops or kill them. The air carried dust and storms. Water had to be channeled, controlled, and maintained. These were not occasional inconveniences. They were defining features of existence. The texts do not exempt the gods from this reality. Instead, they describe divine concern with irrigation, with boundaries, with order imposed upon water and land. This concern is not symbolic alone. It reflects a worldview in which even powerful beings must engage with the material conditions of the world if they wish to remain within it. Arrival, then, is not a moment of triumph. It is a beginning of negotiation, not between gods and humans, but between beings and Earth itself. The planet does not speak, but it responds through consequence. Bodies that remain here must breathe its air. They must withstand its gravity. They must experience its cycles. Over time, the texts begin to reflect this pressure. Not directly, not as complaint, but through emphasis. Shelter becomes important. Enclosures appear. Sacred spaces are defined not just as holy, but as protected. Temples are built with thick walls. Inner chambers are cooled. Access is regulated. These are not aesthetic choices, they are functional. The idea that divine presence requires controlled environments is one of the clearest indicators that Earth was not effortlessly compatible. A being that can exist anywhere without consequence does not need shelter. A being unaffected by climate does not need enclosed space. Yet the Sumerian gods are consistently associated with specific structures designed to stabilize conditions. This does not imply weakness. It implies embodiment. The texts do not describe the gods as abstract forces alone. They eat, they rest, they grow weary, they complain of labor. These are not metaphors layered on later by human imagination. They are integral to the narrative from early on. Arrival into a world that does not adapt means that the burden of adjustment falls entirely on the newcomer. Earth does not change its gravity. It does not alter its chemistry. It does not slow time. The planet remains indifferent. It is neither hostile nor welcoming. It simply is. As divine figures remain present, they begin to act less directly. Tasks are delegated. Labor is transferred. Humans are created or instructed to take on roles that reduce the burden on the gods. This is not framed as generosity. It is framed as necessity. The work of maintaining Earth systems is heavy. It requires constant effort. The texts describe gods digging canals, shaping land, building foundations. These are not acts of omnipotence, they're acts of labour. The gods tire of them. They seek relief. This is one of the most revealing aspects of the narrative. A being that arrives into a world perfectly suited to it does not grow weary of basic maintenance. Fatigue implies friction. Earth's cycles continue regardless. Day follows night. Flood follows drought. The texts never suggest that these rhythms were altered to ease divine presence. Instead, divine calendars are built around them. Festivals are timed to lunar phases. Rituals align with seasonal changes. Divine life adapts itself to planetary time, not the other way around. This adaptation is gradual. It is not acknowledged as loss. It is simply the way things come to be. Authority becomes less physical. Presence becomes less constant. Distance increases, not because Earth expels its occupants, but because remaining close requires more than is sustainable. The Anunnaki, in particular, are never described as immune to this process. They are not depicted as eternal visitors untouched by environment. They emerge within an already functioning divine order and take on roles shaped by that order. Over time, those roles shift away from direct engagement with the surface world. They become judges rather than labourers, deciders rather than builders. Their domain moves downward, inward, away from constant exposure. This is not portrayed as punishment. It is portrayed as alignment with function. Earth's surface is demanding. Its cycles are relentless. Distance becomes a form of preservation. Arrival, then, sets in motion a long process. Presence leads to adaptation. Adaptation leads to restructuring. Restructuring leads to withdrawal from direct engagement. None of this is framed as failure. It is framed as response. The Sumerian texts never say that Earth rejected the gods. They never claim that the planet was toxic or hostile in an active sense. Instead, they show us a world that continues unchanged, requiring anyone who remains to conform. Even the divine are not exceptions to this rule. This perspective is subtle, but it is consistent. Earth is not a battlefield. It is not conquered. It is endured, and endurance reshapes those who attempt it. As we continue, the focus will narrow further. We will look more closely at how physical conditions like gravity and atmosphere begin to appear indirectly in the texts, not as scientific descriptions, but as lived realities that influence divine behaviour. The arrival has already happened. The world has not changed. What remains is the long consequence of staying. The Sumerian texts never speak of gravity by name. They never describe atmosphere as a concept or analyse the physical forces that govern bodies in motion. And yet, these forces are present everywhere in the background of the narrative, shaping behaviour, shaping necessity, shaping what can and cannot be sustained over time. The strain they impose does not announce itself suddenly. It emerges quietly, through implication, through the gradual shift in what the texts choose to emphasise. From the beginning, the world described in these writings is heavy, not emotionally, but physically. Things fall downward. Structures must be supported, bodies rest upon the ground, water flows downhill. Nothing floats freely for long. This is not remarked upon because it is assumed. It is simply how existence works. But assumption does not mean absence of consequence. It means consequence is constant. The gods, as they are described in the Sumerian worldview, are not detached observers hovering outside physical reality. They move within it. They act upon it. They are subject to its basic conditions. When they walk, the ground bears their weight. When they build, materials must be lifted and placed. When they dwell, air must circulate, heat must be moderated, water must be managed. The earliest hints of strain appear not as complaint, but as accommodation. Structures are reinforced, sacred spaces are enclosed, access is regulated. These details are easy to overlook, but they matter. A being that exists without weight does not need foundations. A presence unaffected by air does not need chambers. The existence of these features tells us that physical reality applies. Atmosphere, in particular, occupies a subtle but constant role in the texts. The god Enlil, whose domain is the air between heaven and earth, is not associated with emptiness or abstraction. He governs wind, storm, breath itself. Air is not nothing, it is substance. It moves, it presses, it carries heat and cold, it sustains life, but it also exhausts it. The importance of breath appears repeatedly, not as biology, but as vitality. To breathe is to remain present. To lose breath is to lose life. This applies to humans, and it applies to gods. When the texts describe divine fatigue, they do so in language that implies exertion. Labour drains, rest restores. These are atmospheric realities. Gravity and atmosphere together create resistance. Movement requires effort. Work requires recovery. Remaining upright requires balance. These are not obstacles that can be ignored indefinitely. Over time, they shape behaviour. One of the clearest indicators of this strain is the emphasis on rest. The gods do not simply work endlessly. They sleep. They recline. They seek relief from labour. When junior gods complain of exhaustion, it is not framed as moral failing. It is framed as inevitability. The work of maintaining the world under Earth's conditions is heavy. The creation of humans in this context is not a narrative of domination. It is a narrative of load redistribution. The gods are burdened. They seek assistance. This implies that remaining active within Earth's system carries a cost. If the environment were effortless, there would be no need to transfer labour. Atmospheric conditions also shape time. Days are marked by light and darkness. Nights bring rest. The texts repeatedly align divine activity with these cycles. Rituals occur at dawn. Festivals follow lunar calendars. Even the gods do not operate outside planetary rhythm. They synchronize themselves to it. Gravity imposes another kind of time. Aging, not sudden decay, but gradual change. While divine lifespans are long, they are not described as infinite within the earthbound narrative. Reigns are measured, periods are counted, duration matters. Duration implies accumulation of strain. The Sumerian king list, with its impossibly long reigns before the flood, hints at a time when conditions were different, when proximity between divine and mortal realms was closer, when lifespans stretched beyond later limits. But even here, time is counted. Even here, reigns end. This suggests that Earth's influence was already present, even if its full weight had not yet asserted itself. After the flood, the change is unmistakable. Lifespans shorten. Mortality becomes fixed. This is not described as punishment alone. It is described as adjustment. The world after the flood operates under stricter constraints. The air is the same, gravity is the same, but tolerance is reduced. Bodies endure less. The gods, too, alter their behaviour. They appear less frequently. They act through intermediaries. Their presence becomes ritual rather than constant. This shift aligns with increased strain. Prolonged exposure is no longer sustainable. Atmosphere also carries sound. This detail becomes crucial in later texts. Human noise rises. Cities grow loud. The gods complain not of rebellion or sin, but of disturbance. Sound travels through air. The same medium that sustains breath carries disruption. The gods' irritation is environmental, not moral. This suggests closeness. To be disturbed by sound is to be near. To require quiet is to need rest. The gods are not distant observers at this stage. They're close enough to be affected by atmospheric vibration. This proximity has consequences. Gravity keeps them grounded. Atmosphere keeps them engaged. Together, these forces bind presence to cost. Over time, the texts reflect a desire for distance, not abandonment, but separation. The establishment of heavens above and underworld below creates buffer zones. Space becomes protective. The Anunnaki, whose roles increasingly associate them with judgment and the underworld, occupy a realm less exposed to surface conditions. This is not described as exile, it is functionally advantageous. The underworld is stable, it does not flood, it does not host agriculture, it is quiet, it is constant. The sky too is distant, high above weather, beyond human noise, beyond the dust and heat of the plains. These vertical separations align with physical relief. Distance reduces strain. The texts do not articulate this in physical terms, but the pattern is consistent. The more demanding the surface becomes, the more divine presence withdraws from it. Authority remains, influence persists, but embodiment lessens. Even temples, which once hosted direct presence, become symbolic centres rather than residences. Statues replace living presence. Ritual replaces interaction. Memory replaces experience. These are not signs of abandonment. They are signs of accommodation to environmental limits. Gravity and atmosphere do not attack. They do not choose. They apply equally, and because they apply equally, they shape behaviour universally. Power does not negate physics, it negotiates with it. The Sumerian worldview does not present this as tragedy, it presents it as order. The cosmos functions because roles are adjusted. Beings find their appropriate domains. The surface world belongs increasingly to humans, who are adapted to its conditions. The divine shifts elsewhere. This does not mean the gods are diminished. It means their mode of existence changes. The texts emphasize regulation, hierarchy, and distance as stability increases. The world becomes manageable because strain is redistributed. As we continue forward, we will see how this strain manifests more clearly through the language of need, how eating, drinking, resting, and recovery become central themes, how Earth's conditions do not defeat the Anunnaki, but slowly define what kind of presence is possible. For now, the pressure is still subtle. Gravity pulls, air presses, time moves. The first signs of strain have appeared, not as collapse, but as adjustment. And adjustment, once begun, does not reverse. As the Sumerian texts progress, something quiet but unmistakable begins to happen. The language shifts, the emphasis changes, the early focus on authority, command, and cosmic arrangement gives way to something far more practical. The texts begin to describe needs, not in passing, not as symbolic gestures, but as recurring elements woven into the divine narrative. Food appears, rest appears, shelter appears, recovery appears. This is not accidental, and it is not a later corruption of the tradition. It is part of how the Sumerians understood what prolonged presence within the world actually entails. In the earliest compositions, power is assumed. It does not need to be demonstrated or repeated. The gods separate heaven and earth. They establish order. They assign domains. These actions are foundational, and once they are done, the texts do not dwell on them. Power, once exercised, becomes background. What moves to the foreground instead is maintenance. This is where need enters the narrative, not as weakness but as condition. The world that has been ordered now must be sustained. Fields must be irrigated, canals must be cleared, temples must be maintained, offerings must be prepared. None of these tasks are optional, and none of them happen automatically. The gods do not simply decree abundance and withdraw. They remain involved, at least initially, in the ongoing work required to keep the system functioning. The texts describe junior gods performing labour. They dig, they carry, they build, they complain. This complaint is not framed as rebellion against authority. It is framed as exhaustion. The labour is heavy. It does not end. The environment does not ease. This is one of the clearest indications that the world, once established, imposes demands that power alone does not erase. When the gods complain, they do not question who is in charge. They question how long the work can continue. This distinction matters. The problem is not hierarchy. The problem is endurance, and endurance is always tied to need. Food appears in the texts as sustenance, not indulgence. Offerings are required, meals are prepared. The gods consume what is given. This is not portrayed as symbolic nourishment alone, it is practical. Without offerings, divine presence weakens, temples fall silent, order begins to fray, the system depends on exchange. This reciprocal structure is central to Sumerian religion. Humans provide food, drink, and service. The gods provide protection, fertility, and order. But reciprocity implies dependence. It implies that neither side is entirely self-sufficient within the world as it exists. The gods need offerings, humans need favour. The environment sits beneath both, unchanged. Rest, too, becomes prominent. The gods sleep, they retreat, they seek quiet. When the noise of human cities becomes unbearable, it is not because the gods lack authority to silence them. It is because constant disturbance interferes with recovery. Rest is not a luxury, it is necessary. This focus on rest reveals something profound. A being that is purely power does not need to recover. A presence that cannot be depleted does not require sleep. The Sumerian texts do not describe the gods as inexhaustible within the world. They describe them as powerful, but subject to fatigue when engaged in continuous activity. Shelter follows naturally. Temples are not open platforms. They are enclosed spaces. Inner sanctuaries are protected. Access is limited. These structures regulate light, sound, temperature, and proximity. They are not built for display alone. They create conditions where presence can be sustained. The fact that gods dwell in temples rather than simply existing everywhere at once tells us that environment matters, exposure matters, control of surroundings matters. These are needs, not symbols. Over time, the texts describe fewer direct acts of power and more systems that carry power forward without constant intervention. Laws are established, rituals are codified, calendars are fixed, authority becomes procedural. This shift reduces strain. It allows the world to function without continuous divine exertion. Needs drive this transition. When direct presence becomes costly, structure becomes necessary. When exertion accumulates, delegation follows. Humans are created or instructed not as slaves in a modern sense, but as caretakers of a system that the gods no longer wish to maintain alone. This does not diminish the gods, it situates them. They are part of the system, not outside it. Their power shapes the system, but once shaped, the system shapes them in return. The Anunnaki, in particular, are increasingly associated with functions that require judgment rather than labour. They decree fate, they oversee transitions, they sit in council. These roles are less physically demanding. They require presence but not constant exposure. This reassignment is not framed as retreat, it is framed as order. Each being occupies the domain most suited to its function. Earth's surface becomes the realm of work, growth and noise. The underworld becomes the realm of judgment and quiet. The heavens become the realm of distance and oversight. Needs drive this stratification. The texts do not say this explicitly, but the pattern is consistent. Where strain is greatest, presence diminishes. Where conditions are stable, authority consolidates. Eating, drinking, resting and recovering appear again and again because they cannot be ignored. They are the markers of sustained existence within a physical world. They are the signs that power has limits when embodied. The Sumerians did not see this as contradiction. They did not struggle to reconcile divine power with divine need. To them, power without context was meaningless. Power mattered only insofar as it functioned within reality. This worldview differs sharply from later theological systems that emphasize omnipotence and transcendence. The Sumerian gods are not outside the world looking in. They are within it, negotiating its demands. Needs also humanize the divine, but not in a sentimental way. They make the gods comprehensible. They make their decisions understandable. When the gods seek to reduce labour, it is not cruelty. It is relief. When they seek quiet, it is not tyranny. It is recovery. This perspective changes how events like the flood are understood. The flood is not framed as moral cleansing. It is framed as environmental reset. Noise is reduced. Activity ceases. The world returns briefly to stillness. This stillness is restorative, not righteous. Afterward, limits are imposed. Lifespans shorten. Population growth is regulated. These measures are not about punishment. They are about sustainability. The system must remain within tolerable bounds. Needs drive policy, needs shape cosmology, needs determine where gods dwell and how they interact. Power establishes order, but need maintains it. As the texts continue, the language of need does not replace power entirely. Authority remains, decisions are made, fate is fixed. But these actions are increasingly mediated. Distance grows. Presence becomes symbolic. The gods are remembered more often than encountered. This is not disappearance. It is transformation. The divine remains woven into the world through ritual, memory and structure, rather than through constant physical engagement. Earth does not force this change. It simply remains consistent. Gravity continues. Air continues. Time continues. Needs accumulate, and adaptation follows. What begins as a subtle shift in language becomes a defining feature of the worldview. The gods are not diminished by need, they are shaped by it, and in being shaped they reveal something essential about the world itself. The next stage will take this further. Needs do not remain abstract. They manifest in specific requirements. Eating, resting and recovery move from background details to central concerns, and with them, the nature of divine presence continues to evolve, not abruptly, but steadily, as it has from the beginning. As the Sumerian texts continue to unfold, presence itself begins to change meaning. In the earliest layers, divine beings are described as moving freely, appearing where action is required, intervening directly in the shaping of the world. Their presence is active, mobile, and immediate. They do not belong to a single place. They belong to function. Where order must be imposed, they appear. Where chaos threatens, they act. But this mode of existence does not persist unchanged. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the texts begin to anchor divine beings to locations, not temporarily, not symbolically, but concretely. Gods begin to dwell. They reside. They occupy. This is a subtle shift, but it carries enormous weight. To reside is to remain. To remain is to submit to continuity. And continuity within a physical world always brings consequence. The establishment of residence is never described as a loss of freedom. It is framed as stability. The world, once ordered, must be maintained, and maintenance requires fixed points. Canals need oversight. Cities require protection. Fields depend on regular cycles. The gods, once mobile agents of creation, become guardians of place. This transition is not abrupt. It does not arrive with announcement or explanation. It emerges through repetition. A god is associated with a city. A temple is raised. Offerings are directed to a specific location. Over time, presence that was once distributed becomes concentrated. Divine activity flows towards centres rather than dispersing across the landscape. The moment a god is said to dwell somewhere, that place becomes different. It acquires boundaries, rules, access points. Residence creates inside and outside. Not everyone may enter. Not every sound may pass through. Not every action is permitted. These distinctions matter because they reveal the growing importance of environmental control. A being that merely passes through does not need walls. A being that remains does. Temples in this context are not simply houses of worship. They are environments. They regulate light. They soften sound. They moderate temperature. They separate the divine from the constant movement of the outside world. They are in effect buffers between Earth's demands and sustained presence. The texts never describe temples as palaces of luxury in the way later cultures might imagine them. They emphasize function, storage rooms, inner sanctuaries, courtyards, processional paths. These are practical features. They facilitate regularity. They create predictability in a world defined by change. As residence becomes established, divine presence becomes less diffuse. Instead of appearing anywhere at any time the gods are approached, humans travel to them. Offerings are brought. Rituals are performed on schedule. This is a reversal of movement. Presence no longer comes to the world freely, the world comes to presence. This change benefits both sides. Humans know where to direct their attention. The gods no longer need to move constantly through unstable environments. Distance reduces strain. Structure reduces unpredictability. The Anunnaki within this framework are increasingly associated with domains that are removed from daily life. They are not tied to fields or canals. They are tied to thresholds, judgment, transition, fate. Their presence is invoked, not encountered. Their authority is acknowledged, not observed. Residence also alters how time is experienced. A being that resides participates in cycles, daily offerings, monthly festivals, annual rites. Time becomes structured around presence rather than interrupted by it. This further integrates divine existence into the planetary rhythm. The texts reflect this integration through calendars. Sacred days are fixed. Observances recur. The gods are honoured at specific times, not spontaneously. This predictability stabilizes both divine and human life. It also reduces the need for constant interaction. The shift from presence to residence marks a turning point in how power operates. Power no longer needs to be demonstrated repeatedly. It is assumed through permanence. A god who resides in a city does not need to appear daily. Their temple stands as proof of authority. Their absence from the streets does not diminish their influence. This is not withdrawal. It is consolidation. Earth's role in this transition remains quiet but constant. A world that demands continual adaptation rewards stability. Movement exposes one to heat, cold, noise, unpredictability. Residence allows control. Control allows endurance. The texts do not frame this as fear. They frame it as wisdom. The gods choose to dwell because dwelling makes sustained influence possible. Presence everywhere is costly. Presence somewhere is manageable. Over time, this logic extends further. Residence becomes symbolic rather than literal. Statues replace living presence. Ritual replaces conversation. Memory replaces interaction. The god is said to dwell in the temple, but what that dwelling means evolves. The physical strain of constant embodiment lessens as presence becomes representational. The statue does not tire. The ritual does not age. The temple endures across generations. This allows authority to persist without the same environmental cost. Humans take on more responsibility in this arrangement. They maintain the temple. They perform the rites. They ensure offerings are delivered. In doing so, they sustain the system that allows the gods to remain at distance while still governing. This arrangement is reciprocal but asymmetrical. Humans labour. The gods oversee. Earth absorbs the effort. The balance holds as long as each role is maintained. The texts suggest that this system was not immediately perfected. There are tensions, complaints, adjustments, but the overall direction is clear. Residence replaces roaming presence. Distance replaces immediacy. Structure replaces spontaneity. What is striking is how little drama accompanies this change. There is no lament for lost closeness, no nostalgia for wandering gods. The transition is treated as natural, as appropriate, as part of the maturation of the world. In earlier times, when the world was young and unstable, direct presence was necessary. As order solidifies, Residence suffices. The gods do not abandon the world. They settle into it differently. This settling reshapes how humans perceive the divine. Interaction becomes formal. Access becomes regulated. Knowledge becomes mediated through priesthood rather than experience. The divine becomes less familiar, but more stable. Earth remains unchanged throughout. Its gravity still pulls. Its air still presses. Its seasons still turn. What changes is how beings position themselves within it. Residence is a strategy, not of escape, but of endurance. It acknowledges that the world cannot be reshaped endlessly without cost. It accepts limitation without conceding authority. As the texts continue, this pattern deepens. Residence leads to delegation. Delegation leads to abstraction. Abstraction leads to memory. Each step reduces direct exposure while preserving influence. The Anunnaki, increasingly removed from surface life, exemplify this trajectory. They are present through decree rather than appearance, through judgment rather than labour, through fate rather than force. This is not the story of gods being driven away. It is the story of gods learning how to remain without being consumed by the conditions of the world they inhabit. And so, presence narrows, residence stabilizes, the world continues, the relationship persists, altered but intact. What follows is not disappearance, but redefinition, shaped by the same quiet pressures that have been at work from the beginning. As the Sumerian texts continue to shift away from descriptions of direct divine action and towards systems that preserve order over time, the role of temples begins to clarify. They are never introduced as monuments in the way later civilizations would understand them. They are not primarily symbols of dominance, nor are they designed to impress through scale alone. Instead, they function as stabilizers. They exist to make continued presence possible within a world that does not pause, soften, or adjust itself for anyone. This distinction matters because it reveals how the Sumerians understood both their gods and the world those gods inhabited. A monument celebrates what has already been achieved. A stabilizer exists because something is ongoing and vulnerable. The temple belongs to the second category. It is not a declaration of victory over Earth. It is an accommodation to Earth. From the earliest descriptions, temples are treated as working structures. They are maintained daily. They are cleaned, supplied, repaired, and regulated. Their significance lies not in how they look from a distance, but in how they function continuously. A temple that is not maintained fails in its purpose, regardless of how impressive it once appeared. The texts describe temples as houses. This is not metaphorical language. The gods are said to dwell there. They receive food there. They rest there. They withdraw there. These are not abstract concepts. They are behaviours associated with endurance within a physical environment. The Sumerian world was defined by extremes. Heat could be relentless. Floods could arrive without warning. Dust and wind moved constantly across the plains. Noise from human activity filled the air in growing cities. The temple, by contrast, offered controlled space. Thick walls reduced sound. Enclosed rooms moderated temperature. Elevated platforms protected against floodwaters. Orientation aligned the building with celestial cycles rather than surface chaos. These features are not symbolic. They are practical responses to environmental pressure. A being that does not require environmental buffering does not need walls, elevation, or enclosure. The presence of these features tells us that prolonged exposure mattered. Temples also created predictability. Rituals followed schedules. Offerings arrived at fixed times. Movements within the space were regulated. This predictability reduced strain. It replaced improvisation with routine. In a world governed by unpredictable natural forces, routine is stabilizing. The gods, as described in the texts, benefit from this stability. Their presence becomes less exposed. Their interactions become mediated. They no longer need to move constantly through fields, streets, and waterways. The world comes to them in controlled form. This is not distance born of indifference. It is distance born of necessity. Earth's surface is dynamic. The temple is static. Static environments are easier to sustain. The importance of this becomes clearer when we look at what happens when temples are neglected. The texts treat neglect as dangerous. Disorder follows, favour withdraws, floods worsen, crops fail. This is not because the gods are petty. It is because the stabilising mechanism has broken down. Without the temple functioning properly, the buffer between divine presence and environmental strain collapses. The temple, then, is not a stage for spectacle. It is infrastructure. It is part of the system that allows the gods to remain involved without being overwhelmed. This also explains why temples are often rebuilt in the same locations over centuries, even after destruction. The site itself matters. It is not arbitrary. It is chosen for stability. Elevation, proximity to water, alignment with sky and land all factor into its selection. Once established, abandoning the site would mean losing the accumulated equilibrium. The Anunnaki, whose roles increasingly involve judgment and fate rather than daily labour, are associated with these stabilised spaces indirectly. Their authority is exercised through ritual invocation, legal pronouncement, and cosmic order rather than physical action. The temple becomes the interface through which this authority is accessed. What is striking is how little emphasis the texts place on visual grandeur. While later reconstructions imagine towering structures meant to dominate the skyline, the textual focus remains functional. Storage rooms for offerings, chambers for rest, inner sanctuaries protected from intrusion. These are the features that matter. This suggests that the Sumerians did not view their gods as beings who required admiration to exist. They viewed them as beings who required support to remain present. Admiration alone does nothing to mitigate heat, noise, or exhaustion. Structure does. Temples also regulate human behaviour. Access is limited. Movement is controlled. Speech is moderated. Silence is enforced in inner areas. These controls benefit the gods by reducing disturbance. They also benefit humans by preventing chaos. The temple imposes order on both sides of the relationship. This mutual regulation is essential. The gods do not simply demand temples. Humans build them because they work. They stabilize the relationship. They reduce unpredictability. They make favor reliable. As divine presence becomes increasingly associated with temples rather than open space, direct encounters diminish. Humans do not expect to meet gods in fields or streets. They expect to approach them through ritual. This expectation reshapes belief. The divine becomes something accessed deliberately, not encountered accidentally. This reduces risk. Uncontrolled encounters are dangerous. Noise, disrespect, error. The temple filters all of this. It slows interaction. It enforces formality. It protects both sides. Earth's role in this arrangement remains constant. It continues to exert pressure. Gravity still pulls. Air still carries sound. Time still moves. The temple does not change these forces. It works around them. Over time, the stabilizing function of temples becomes so central that divine absence outside them is normalized. The gods are no longer expected to walk among humans regularly. Their presence is assumed within the temple, regardless of physical manifestation. The statue stands in place of the body. The ritual stands in place of conversation. This substitution is not deception. It is adaptation. The statue does not tire. It does not age. It does not suffer from heat or noise. It allows divine presence to persist symbolically without environmental cost. The texts do not mourn this shift. They accept it. The system works. Order continues. Favour flows. The world remains stable. The Anunnaki's association with judgment further reinforces this pattern. Judgment does not require movement. It requires authority and distance. The temple provides both. Decisions are pronounced from fixed points. Fate is decreed without physical exertion. As a result, divine influence becomes more abstract but also more enduring. The gods no longer need to intervene constantly because the system carries their will forward. This does not mean Earth has been mastered. It means Earth has been accommodated. The temple is not a declaration of supremacy. It is an acknowledgement of limits. The Sumerians understood that a world governed by cycles cannot be held still. Stability must be constructed, maintained, rebuilt when necessary. The temple embodies this understanding. What follows from this is a gradual redefinition of presence itself. Presence no longer means proximity. It means accessibility through structure. The gods are present because the system functions, not because they are seen. As we move forward, this stabilization leads naturally into delegation. If presence can be maintained through structure, then direct involvement becomes unnecessary. Humans take on more responsibility. Authority moves upward and inward. The surface world becomes increasingly human. The temple remains as the hinge between realms, not a monument to what was, but a mechanism for what continues. And Earth, unchanged and unyielding, continues to apply the same quiet pressure that made such mechanisms necessary in the first place. As the Sumerian texts move further away from beginnings and closer to continuity, a new kind of language begins to appear. It does not arrive abruptly, and it is never announced as a turning point. It seeps into the record slowly, through descriptions that would seem unremarkable if they did not accumulate. Words associated with weariness, with complaint, with recovery, with imbalance begin to surface. This is not the dramatic language of collapse. It is the language of decline, and it is remarkably restrained. The gods are never described as suddenly weakened. There is no single moment where strength vanishes or authority falters. Instead, the texts describe fatigue. They describe burden. They describe conditions that must be managed rather than ignored. Decline, in this worldview, is not failure. It is the cost of duration. Fatigue appears first in the junior gods. They are tasked with labour. They dig canals, raise embankments, shape land, maintain the systems that keep the world ordered. The texts describe their work as continuous. There is no endpoint. Maintenance does not conclude, and eventually they complain. This complaint is not framed as rebellion or moral failing. It is framed as exhaustion. The work is heavy. The world does not pause. This framing matters. A being that exists outside physical limitation does not become tired. Fatigue only exists where effort meets resistance. The Sumerian texts assume resistance as a constant feature of existence within the world. Even divine labour encounters it. Illness too appears in subtle ways. The texts do not medicalize divine suffering, but they do acknowledge imbalance. Something can go wrong. Something can require correction. Rituals are prescribed to restore harmony. Offerings are made to address disturbances. These are not always directed at human ailments. They are part of a broader understanding that systems, including divine ones, can fall out of alignment. The gods are not immune to this logic. When the texts describe divine anger, it is often linked to discomfort. Noise disrupts rest. Disorder strains balance. The response is not always punitive. Sometimes it is corrective. Sometimes it is withdrawal. Decline in this context does not mean loss of status. It means increasing sensitivity. A being that has endured long enough within a demanding environment becomes less tolerant of disturbance. Quiet becomes necessary. Stability becomes valuable. Distance becomes protective. The Anunnaki are increasingly associated with this shift. Their roles emphasize judgment, fate, and the underworld. These are not domains of physical exertion. They are domains of stillness. The underworld is not described as chaotic or turbulent. It is fixed, silent, regulated. This is not accidental. The surface world grows more active over time. Human populations increase. Cities expand. Noise multiplies. Labour intensifies. The texts explicitly link divine irritation to this growth. The complaint is not about sin or disobedience. It is about sound, about constant activity, about the inability to rest. This detail is often misunderstood, but it is crucial. Noise is an atmospheric phenomenon. It travels through air. To be disturbed by noise is to be close enough for air to carry vibration. This implies proximity. The gods are not distant observers at this stage. They are near enough to be affected. Fatigue, then, is environmental. It is not the result of diminished power. It is the result of sustained exposure. The flood narrative makes this explicit without stating it directly. The flood reduces activity. It silences the world. For a time, everything becomes still. The gods are described as regretful afterward, not because destruction was unjust, but because the loss of offerings creates another problem. Silence alone is not sustainable. Balance requires activity, but not excess. This tension reveals the underlying issue. The world must remain within certain bounds for divine presence to be tolerable. Too little activity and the gods lack sustenance. Too much activity and the gods lack rest. The system requires regulation. Illness appears again in the form of imbalance after the flood. Mortality is fixed. Lifespans shorten. Population growth is limited. These changes are often framed as punishments, but they also function as controls. They reduce strain. They prevent a return to intolerable conditions. The language used to describe these measures is administrative rather than emotional. Decisions are made, limits are imposed, fates are decreed. This is not the language of rage, it is the language of management. The Sumerians did not conceptualize decline as a tragic fall from perfection. They conceptualized it as adjustment to reality. The world after the flood is not worse in moral terms. It is stricter, less forgiving, more bounded. The gods themselves adapt accordingly. They appear less frequently. Their direct involvement diminishes. Their presence becomes mediated through ritual, law, and memory. This reduces exposure. It reduces fatigue. It allows authority to persist without constant exertion. Illness, when it appears in the texts, is often addressed through ritual rather than cure. Restoration is about rebalancing relationships, not eliminating vulnerability. This applies equally to divine and human spheres. The goal is not invulnerability. The goal is sustainability. The Anunnaki's association with judgment further reflects this logic. Judgment does not require physical endurance. It requires continuity. A judge must remain consistent, not active. The underworld, as their domain, offers this consistency. It is not subject to seasonal change. It does not flood. It does not host agriculture. It does not grow louder over time. This is not framed as retreat. It is framed as proper placement. Each domain carries different levels of strain. The surface world is dynamic and demanding. The underworld is stable and quiet. The heavens are distant and regular. Authority distributes itself accordingly. Decline, then, is not collapse. It is redistribution of presence. Fatigue signals the need for change, not the end of power. The texts reinforce this by continuing to attribute authority to the gods, even as their direct actions diminish. Laws remain divine in origin. Kingship remains sanctioned. Fate remains decreed. Nothing essential is lost. Only the mode of engagement changes. This is why the language of decline never becomes dramatic. There is no lamentation for weakened gods. There is no prophecy of divine death. There is only a gradual reorientation towards structures that minimize strain. The Sumerians did not imagine eternal stasis. They imagined balance achieved through adjustment. Decline is one form of adjustment. It acknowledges limits without surrendering order. Fatigue and illness serve as indicators, not endpoints. They signal that the current arrangement is unsustainable. The response is not denial. It is reconfiguration. This worldview contrasts sharply with modern narratives that equate decline with failure. In the Sumerian perspective, decline is information. It tells you something about the world and your place within it. The gods listen to this information. They change their behavior. They delegate labor. They withdraw from constant exposure. They establish institutions that carry their will forward without requiring their bodies. This is not weakness, it is strategy. Earth remains constant throughout. Its gravity does not lessen. Its air does not quiet itself. Its cycles do not slow. The strain it imposes is impartial. It affects anyone who remains long enough. The Anunnaki, like other divine figures, are shaped by this reality. Their roles become increasingly abstract. Their presence becomes less physical. Their authority becomes more procedural. The language of the text reflects this shift. There is less emphasis on action and more on decree. Less on movement and more on placement. Less on force and more on fate. This is the language of endurance, of systems designed to last without exhausting those who oversee them. As we move forward, this decline will become even more implicit. The text will say less and less about direct interaction and more about memory, inheritance, and continuation. What is no longer described is as important as what remains. Fatigue does not end the story. It changes how the story is told. Illness does not remove authority. It refines its expression. The gods are not leaving yet. But they are no longer what they were at the beginning. Earth has not defeated them. It has taught them how costly presence can be, and so the narrative continues, quieter now, more measured, shaped by an understanding that nothing remains unchanged when it endures long enough within a world that never adapts in return. As the Sumerian texts continue forward, time itself begins to feel less stable, less uniform, less predictable than it did at the beginning of the narrative. This is not because the scribes suddenly became confused about chronology. It is because time, as experienced by those who remained on Earth, was no longer behaving as it once had. The texts do not explain this directly. They never pause to define time as a concept. Instead, they reveal its shifting nature through measurement, comparison, and contrast. In the earliest layers of tradition, time stretches. Reigns last tens of thousands of years. Generations pass slowly. Change occurs, but it does not hurry. The world feels young, expansive, unpressured. These are not symbolic flourishes. They reflect a worldview in which duration itself operated under different assumptions. Time was present, but it was not urgent. As the narrative moves forward, this sense of elongated duration begins to compress. Lifespans shorten. Events cluster more closely together. The texts begin to care about sequencing rather than vast spans. Time becomes something that must be tracked carefully because it is no longer abundant. This shift coincides with prolonged presence on Earth and with increasing exposure to its cycles. Earth does not experience time abstractly. It experiences it rhythmically. Days turn into nights. Seasons follow one another. Floods arrive and recede. Crops grow and are harvested. These cycles impose repetition. Repetition creates awareness. Awareness creates pressure. For beings whose origin lies outside this rhythm, prolonged exposure changes perception. Time stops being an open expanse and becomes a pattern that must be followed. The Sumerian texts reflect this transition through their increasing reliance on calendars, festivals, and ritual timing. The gods themselves are bound to these markers. Their actions align with lunar months. Their authority is invoked on specific days. Time becomes procedural. This is not limitation imposed by decree. It is adaptation to environment. A world governed by cycles demands synchronization. Anyone who remains must move in step or be left behind. The Anunnaki, whose roles emerge more clearly as the texts progress, are deeply associated with fate and judgment. Fate is not timeless. It unfolds. It must be fixed at a moment. Judgment requires sequence, before and after matter. This embeds them even more firmly within temporal flow. The earlier gods associated with creation and separation operate at the level of beginnings. The Anunnaki operate at the level of continuation. Continuation requires timekeeping. It requires memory. It requires anticipation. These are temporal skills. The king lists provide one of the clearest illustrations of this shift. The antediluvian rulers exist in a time that barely resembles historical chronology. Their reigns are immense, their lives stretch beyond human comprehension. But after the flood, time tightens. Reigns shorten. Records become more precise. Time becomes something that passes rather than something that simply exists. This transition mirrors what happens when beings fully enter Earth's rhythm. The planet does not allow timelessness. It insists on sequence. Growth leads to decay. Activity leads to rest. Duration accumulates consequences. The gods are not exempt from this accumulation. While they do not age as humans do, their relationship to time changes. They begin to act with foresight. They impose limits. They plan for sustainability. These behaviours assume finitude, not eternity. The flood itself marks a temporal boundary. Before and after are no longer interchangeable. Memory is divided. The world resets, but it does not return to its original temporal openness. Time after the flood is constrained. Lifespans are capped. Population growth is regulated. These are temporal controls. The Sumerians understood this not as punishment alone, but as recalibration. Time had become too dense. Events were happening too quickly. Noise was constant. The system was overheating. Resetting the world slowed things down, but only temporarily. Permanent limits were required. This reveals a key insight embedded in the texts. Time on Earth accelerates as activity increases. More beings, more work, more sound, more movement. This acceleration creates strain. Slowing time requires reducing activity. Distance, silence, separation. The Anunnaki's association with the underworld aligns with this need. The underworld is not subject to seasonal change. It does not host growth or decay in the same way. It is static. Time that does not rush. It does not pile up. It simply persists. Judgment occurs there because judgment requires stability. A verdict must stand. Fate must remain fixed. The underworld offers a temporal environment where this is possible. The surface does not. The heavens offer another temporal alternative. Celestial movement is regular, predictable. Stars follow fixed paths. The sky provides time without chaos. Those who dwell above are less affected by acceleration. Those who remain below are not. This stratification of realms is also a stratification of time. The surface world moves fastest. The heavens move steadily. The underworld barely moves at all. Authority distributes itself accordingly. The texts never explain this system explicitly, but they consistently reinforce it through narrative placement. Those burdened with judgment and fate move away from the surface. Those engaged in growth and labour remain. Earth's gravity plays a role here as well. Gravity keeps everything bound to the surface. It ensures that time accumulates locally. Distance from the surface reduces exposure to rapid change. This is not stated, but it is implied through spatial organisation. The gods learn this through experience. They respond by limiting presence, by residing rather than roaming, by delegating rather than acting. Each of these choices reduces temporal strain. Time behaves differently for them here because Earth enforces sequence relentlessly. It does not allow events to overlap indefinitely. Everything must follow something else. This forces decision. Decision creates consequence. Consequence accumulates. The longer one remains embedded in this process, the more one feels time's weight. The gods respond by creating systems that distribute that weight. Humans carry labour. Institutions carry memory. Ritual carries continuity. The gods oversee rather than participate. This does not mean the gods escape time entirely. They remain bound to it in altered ways. Festivals recur. Judgments stand. decrees persist, but they are no longer subject to the same pace as surface life. The Anunnaki exemplify this transition. They are not rushed. They do not hurry. They wait. They decree. They observe endings rather than beginnings. This places them at the far end of temporal flow, where speed has slowed to stillness. The Sumerian worldview does not frame this as alienation. It frames it as balance. Different realms require different relationships to time. Earth's surface cannot support timeless presence indefinitely. It demands change. Time behaving differently is not a mystery in this context. It is a consequence of staying. The planet does not slow itself. Those who remain must adjust. As the narrative moves forward, time becomes increasingly important. Memory replaces experience. Records replace encounters. History replaces myth. This is not loss. It is transformation. The gods are still present, but they are present through duration rather than immediacy. Their influence stretches across generations rather than moments. This is a different kind of power, shaped by time rather than opposed to it. Earth has not altered its rhythm. It has revealed it. Those who remain long enough cannot ignore it. What comes next is a further consequence of this realization. When time accelerates and strain accumulates, aging becomes unavoidable, even for those once thought beyond it. And with aging comes a new problem that the texts approach carefully, never directly, but unmistakably all the same. As the Sumerian texts move deeper into continuity rather than origin, the idea of permanence begins to soften. Not collapse, not vanish, but soften. The gods are still powerful. Authority still flows from them. Order still depends on their decisions. And yet, something has changed. The language no longer treats them as untouched by duration. Aging appears, not as decay in the human sense, but as accumulation. Time leaves marks. The texts never say that the gods grow old. They never describe wrinkled bodies or failing strength. That kind of imagery does not belong to the Sumerian worldview. Instead, aging is expressed indirectly, through shifts in role, through increasing distance, through the gradual replacement of action with oversight. These are not random developments. They are the signs of beings who have remained within a consuming environment long enough to be shaped by it. Earth consumes quietly. It does not attack. It does not exhaust through sudden force. It consumes through repetition, through gravity that never releases, through air that must always be breathed, through cycles that never pause. Even a being of immense power cannot remain unchanged under such conditions forever. The earliest divine figures act. They separate, they establish, they intervene. But as the narrative progresses, intervention becomes rarer. Decisions are made in councils rather than through direct force. Decrees replace actions. Presence becomes less physical and more procedural. These are the behaviours of beings who have learned that continued exertion carries cost. Aging in this sense is not biological. It is functional. It is the recognition that certain modes of existence are no longer sustainable. A god who once walked freely among humans now remains within a sanctuary. A god who once shaped the land now assigns that task to others. A god who once spoke directly now communicates through signs and laws. The Sumerian texts do not frame this as loss of status. They frame it as maturity. Authority does not diminish. It consolidates. But consolidation implies retreat from exposure. The Anunnaki are central to this shift. They are not creators of the world. They emerge within it after structures are already in place. Their authority is significant, but it is specialized. They judge. They decree. They fix fate. These are not the tasks of young beings shaping a world for the first time. These are the tasks of beings overseeing a system that has aged with them. Judgment is a role that benefits from distance. It does not require constant presence. It requires continuity and consistency. These qualities align with a reduced physical footprint. The Anunnaki's increasing association with the underworld reflects this. The underworld is not dynamic. It does not grow. It does not decay. It simply holds. This is a domain suited to beings whose relationship with time has changed. The surface world, by contrast, accelerates. Human populations grow. Cities expand. Noise increases. Labour intensifies. The gods notice this not because they are threatened, but because it affects them. The texts describe divine irritation with sound, with constant activity. This irritation is not moral outrage. It is fatigue. Fatigue accumulates, and accumulation is a form of aging. The flood narrative reveals this more clearly than any other episode. The gods regret their decision afterward, not because destruction was unjust, but because it removed too much activity. Silence alone is not sustainable. The system requires balance. This regret suggests learning. It suggests adjustment based on experience. Experience implies duration. Duration implies aging. After the flood, the world is stricter. Lifespans shorten. Limits are imposed. These changes affect humans most directly, but they also benefit the gods. Reduced population means reduced noise. Shorter lives mean less accumulation. The world becomes easier to tolerate. This is not punishment for humanity's sake alone. It is adaptation for divine endurance. The texts never say that the gods fear death. They never suggest that they could be consumed entirely. But they do suggest that remaining unchanged was no longer possible. Aging in this framework is not about ending. It is about reconfiguration. The gods increasingly rely on memory rather than presence. Their actions are remembered in hymns. Their decisions are preserved in lore. Their authority is invoked through ritual. This allows them to persist without continuous exertion. Memory does not tire. Lore does not age. The replacement of living presence with symbolic presence is one of the clearest signs of this aging process. A statue does not breathe. It does not feel heat. It does not grow weary. It stands as a stable representation of authority. By allowing representation to replace embodiment, the gods reduce their exposure to the consuming conditions of the surface world. This does not mean they cease to exist physically within the narrative. It means physicality becomes optional rather than constant. Appearance becomes exceptional rather than routine. The Sumerians did not view this as abandonment. They viewed it as order settling into its final form. The early chaos of creation required active shaping. The mature world required governance. Governance is a role suited to beings who have endured. It does not require youth. It requires perspective. Aging then brings clarity. The gods become less reactive and more deliberate. They impose systems rather than respond to events. They establish boundaries rather than intervene in every disturbance. This reduces strain and preserves authority. The Anunnaki's function as determiners of fate reflects this shift perfectly. Fate is fixed. It does not change easily. Those who decree fate must themselves be stable. They must exist outside the rapid flow of surface time. Aging pushes them towards such positions. The consuming nature of Earth is not portrayed as malevolent. It is portrayed as unavoidable. Anything that remains long enough is shaped by it. Even mountains erode. Even rivers change course. The gods are not exempt from this principle. What makes them distinct is not immunity, but adaptability. They recognize the cost of continued presence and alter their mode of existence accordingly. This worldview differs sharply from later ideas of eternal, unchanging divinity. In the Sumerian imagination, eternity is not static. It is maintained through adjustment. A god who refuses to adjust would be consumed, not destroyed outright, but eroded. Authority would fray. Presence would become unsustainable. The texts imply that wisdom lies in knowing when to withdraw, when to delegate, when to become less visible. This is why the gods do not vanish suddenly. They fade from daily life. They retreat into structured roles. They allow humans to take on more responsibility. They move into domains where Earth's consuming processes are weaker. The heavens are less noisy. The underworld is more stable. Distance from the surface reduces exposure. This spatial reorganization mirrors the internal shift brought on by duration. The Sumerian texts do not sentimentalize this process. They do not mourn the loss of closeness. They accept it. The world has matured. The relationship between divine and human has changed accordingly. Aging in this sense is not tragedy. It is evidence of survival. Only beings who endure long enough can age. The Anunnaki are not portrayed as relics of a bygone era. They are portrayed as custodians of what remains. Their authority persists precisely because they no longer attempt to dominate the surface world directly. Earth has not defeated them. It has consumed the parts of them that were unsustainable. What remains is quieter, more distant, more procedural, but also more stable. As the narrative continues, this aging will lead to another shift. Presence will not only become distant, it will become mediated almost entirely through others. Delegation will replace action. Humans will become essential to maintaining order. And the gods, shaped by time and environment, will accept this not as loss, but as necessity. The world continues, the gods endure, but they do so differently now, marked by the long wait of a planet that never adapted to them and never needed to. As the Sumerian texts continue forward, delegation does not appear as a sudden innovation. It emerges as an answer to pressure that has already been building for a long time. The world is ordered, but it is demanding. The gods remain authoritative, but they are no longer willing or able to shoulder every task that sustained that order. What follows is not abandonment, but dependence, and at the centre of that dependence stands human labour. The earliest layers of the tradition assume divine action as direct and physical. The gods shape the land, manage water, establish boundaries, and maintain balance through their own effort. But as the texts accumulate, this model becomes increasingly strained. The work never ends. Canals must be cleared again and again, embankments erode, fields must be tended every season, cities grow, and with growth comes complexity. The divine burden increases rather than diminishes. The texts do not frame this as a failure of power. They frame it as a problem of scale. A world that continues to function generates endless maintenance. Creation is finite. Preservation is not. It is here that delegation becomes unavoidable. The junior gods are already labouring and they are exhausted. Their complaints are not framed as insubordination. They are framed as inevitability. The work is too much. The environment does not relent. Earth demands constant input, and even divine bodies feel the accumulation of effort. The solution that emerges is not destruction, and it is not withdrawal. It is redistribution. Labour is transferred downward. Responsibility is shared. Humanity enters the narrative not as an afterthought, but as a structural necessity. The creation of humans, as described in the Sumerian texts, is practical rather than triumphant. It is not presented as the pinnacle of divine creativity. It is presented as a response to crisis. The gods need relief. The system needs workers. Earth needs tending. Humans are shaped to fill that role. This origin matters because it defines the relationship from the beginning. Humans are not created to replace the gods. They are created to support a system the gods no longer wish to maintain alone. Labour is not punishment. It is function. The texts are explicit about this. Humans dig canals. Humans pile earth. Humans build temples. Humans cultivate fields. These tasks mirror exactly the work the junior gods had been performing. Nothing fundamentally changes except who performs the labour. This transfer is not described as degradation of humanity. On the contrary, it grants humans a place within cosmic order. Labour becomes meaningful. Work sustains the world. Human effort becomes part of divine maintenance. But delegation creates dependence. Once the gods rely on human labour, The system can no longer function without it. Offerings must be prepared. Temples must be maintained. Rituals must be performed correctly and on time. If humans fail, the gods are affected. This is not symbolic. It is structural. The Sumerian worldview accepts this interdependence without anxiety. The gods are still superior. Authority remains with them. But the daily functioning of the world now depends on human participation. Earth does not change. The response to Earth's demands does. This dependence reshapes divine behaviour. The gods begin to care deeply about order among humans. Laws are established. Kingship is formalised. Social roles are defined. These are not primarily moral systems. They are organisational systems designed to ensure reliable labour and predictable maintenance. Kingship, in particular, becomes essential. A single ruler concentrates authority, coordinates labour, and enforces order. This reduces chaos. Chaos increases noise. Noise increases strain. Delegation requires control. The texts repeatedly emphasize that kingship descends from heaven. This is not a claim about origin alone. It is a claim about necessity. Human labour must be directed. Direction requires authority. Authority must be unquestioned to be effective. Divine sanction provides this stability. As humans take on more labour, the gods take on more oversight. They move away from fields and into councils. Decisions replace actions. Decrees replace movement. The Anunnaki, whose roles emphasize judgment and fate, exemplify this shift. They do not dig canals, they determine outcomes. This division of labour aligns perfectly with the environmental pressures already described. Physical work is costly under Earth's conditions. Judgment is not. Oversight requires attention, not exertion. The gods adapt by moving upward in function. Dependence deepens over time. Humans are not only workers, they become intermediaries. Priests manage temples, scribes record transactions, officials enforce law. Each layer of human administration reduces the need for divine intervention. This is not distance born of disinterest. It is distance born of efficiency. The system works better when humans manage details and the gods manage structure. The texts do not hide the risks of this arrangement. Humans can fail. They can neglect offerings. They can mismanage land. They can create too much noise. When this happens, divine response follows. Not always immediately, sometimes gradually, sometimes catastrophically. The flood narrative represents the extreme end of this tension. Human labour has become too successful. Cities are crowded, activity is constant, the system overheats. Delegation has worked too well. Dependence has become strain. The gods respond by resetting the system. Not because labour is wrong, but because it has exceeded sustainable limits. Afterward, adjustments are made. Lifespans shorten. Population growth is controlled. These measures protect the gods from future overload. What follows is a more stable arrangement. Humans continue to labour. The gods continue to oversee. But boundaries are firmer. Distance increases. Presence becomes more symbolic. This delegation also changes how humans understand themselves. Work becomes identity. Farmers, builders, scribes, priests. Each role supports cosmic order. Labour is no longer merely survival. It is participation. The Sumerians did not romanticize this. Labour is heavy. The texts acknowledge exhaustion, hardship, and suffering. But they also frame work as meaningful. Without it, the world collapses into chaos. Without it, divine order cannot persist. The gods, in turn, become increasingly dependent on the smooth functioning of human society. This dependence is not weakness. It is mutual reinforcement. Humans need divine favour for fertility and protection. The gods need human labour for stability and sustenance. Earth sits beneath this entire arrangement, unchanged. Its gravity still pulls. Its floods still arrive. Its seasons still turn. The delegation of labour does not alter these forces. It responds to them. What changes is who absorbs the cost. Humans take on the daily strain of maintaining fields, canals, and cities. The gods step back, preserving themselves through oversight rather than exertion. This arrangement allows divine authority to persist across generations. It reduces fatigue. It minimizes exposure. It acknowledges that Earth's demands cannot be eliminated, only managed. The Anunnaki's role within this system is telling. They do not concern themselves with agriculture or construction. They concern themselves with fate. Fate is abstract. It is fixed. It does not require physical effort. This makes it sustainable over long durations. Delegation, then, is not decline. It is adaptation refined. It represents a recognition that the world cannot be governed through constant presence without cost. By distributing labour, the gods ensure continuity. The Sumerian texts treat this as the natural maturation of cosmic order. Early chaos required direct intervention. A settled world requires management. Humans are the managers of surface reality. The gods are the guarantors of structure. This relationship persists even as divine presence becomes more distant. Ritual replaces encounter. Law replaces command. Memory replaces experience. None of this weakens authority. It stabilizes it. Earth has not driven the gods away. It has demanded a different arrangement. Delegation is the answer the Sumerians recorded. As the narrative continues, this dependence will deepen further. The gods will rely more heavily on human systems. Human systems will grow more complex, and the distance between divine decision and human action will increase. What emerges is not separation, but layering. The world becomes stratified. Labour below, authority above, memory in between. And through it all, Earth remains the same, quietly consuming effort, shaping behaviour, and forcing adaptation from any being that remains long enough to feel its weight. As the Sumerian texts continue beyond the point where labour has been redistributed, and human systems have taken on the weight of daily maintenance, another shift becomes impossible to ignore. Physical presence, once central to divine authority, begins to lose its necessity. Authority does not disappear, it intensifies. But it no longer requires bodies moving through space to assert itself. This transition is not described as a decision made in a single moment. There is no decree announcing that the gods will step back. Instead, the change unfolds through habit, through repetition, through absence that slowly becomes normal. The gods are still acknowledged, their names are still invoked, their will still shapes outcomes, but they are no longer expected to appear. Early in the tradition, presence and authority are inseparable. To act is to be present. To command is to arrive. Divine figures intervene directly in disputes, in disasters, in moments of uncertainty. But as the world becomes more structured, these interventions become less frequent. Authority no longer needs to announce itself repeatedly, because it has been embedded into systems. Law replaces command. Ritual replaces interaction. Kingship replaces direct rule. Each of these developments reduces the need for physical manifestation while preserving control. The gods do not become weaker, they become less visible. The Sumerian understanding of authority is not performative. Power does not need to be displayed constantly to remain real. Once order has been established, authority persists through continuity rather than action. This is why the texts spend so much time describing institutions and so little time describing appearances as the narrative progresses. Kings rule in the name of the gods. Laws are said to be divinely sanctioned. Cities are placed under divine protection. These arrangements allow authority to operate at distance. A god does not need to stand in the field to ensure the harvest if the system governing irrigation and labour is already in place. This distance is not indifference. It is efficiency. Physical presence is costly under Earth's conditions. Movement requires effort. Exposure brings strain. Authority, by contrast, can operate without exertion. The Anunnaki exemplify this transition more clearly than any other group of deities. They are rarely described as acting physically in the world. They do not build. They do not farm. They do not travel between cities. Their role is to decree, to judge, to determine fate. These actions require legitimacy, not proximity. Judgment does not need to be witnessed to be effective. A fate once fixed does not require repetition. Authority once recognized does not need to be reinforced daily. The Sumerian worldview accepts this fully. Authority replaces presence not because the gods cannot appear, but because appearance is no longer necessary. This replacement has consequences for how humans relate to the divine. Interaction becomes mediated. One does not encounter a god casually. One approaches through ritual, through prayer, through offerings delivered to a place rather than a person. This mediation stabilizes the relationship. Direct encounters are unpredictable. They carry risk, misunderstanding, offense, overwhelm. Authority expressed through institutions is predictable. It can be learned, followed, maintained. Earth's role in this transformation remains unchanged. The environment continues to impose strain on bodies that move within it. By reducing physical presence, the gods reduce exposure to these conditions. Authority, unlike bodies, does not tire. The texts never frame this as loss of intimacy. They do not mourn the absence of wandering gods. Instead, they treat institutional authority as the natural outcome of a world that has settled into long-term patterns. Cities grow, populations increase, complexity multiplies. A system based on constant divine intervention would collapse under its own weight. Authority must become abstract to scale. This abstraction is not empty. It is anchored in ritual, law, and memory. Each reinforces the other. Ritual reenacts divine order. Law enforces it. Memory preserves its origin. The temple plays a crucial role here. It becomes the physical anchor for abstract authority. The god may not appear, but the temple stands. Offerings are received, blessings are expected. Authority is localized without requiring embodiment. This localization allows the gods to be everywhere in principle, while nowhere in particular in practice. Authority is distributed across space without dividing itself. This is a powerful adaptation. The Sumerian text suggests that this shift also protects humans. Direct divine presence is overwhelming. It disrupts ordinary life. It introduces uncertainty. Authority expressed through structure allows humans to live without constant fear of encounter. The gods remain involved, but at a remove. They intervene rarely and decisively rather than frequently and unpredictably. This makes their actions more consequential, not less. Over time, this distance becomes the default. New generations grow up without expecting to see the gods. They learn their will through stories, laws, and rituals. The divine becomes something known rather than experienced. This does not weaken belief. It strengthens it. Belief anchored in memory and structure is more stable than belief dependent on encounter. The Anunnaki's association with fate further reinforces this stability. Fate does not need to be enacted repeatedly. It is declared once and unfolds over time. This aligns perfectly with a model of authority that operates without presence. When disasters occur, they are interpreted through this framework. A flood is not the result of a god arriving in anger. It is the execution of a decision already made. Authority precedes event. This perspective shifts responsibility. Humans are no longer reacting to divine moods. They are living within a system whose rules are known. Obedience, ritual correctness, and social order become central. The gods, in turn, no longer need to manage details. They oversee structure. They maintain legitimacy. They ensure continuity. This replacement of presence with authority is not presented as optional. It is presented as inevitable. A world that continues must be governed differently than a world being created. Physical presence belongs to beginnings. Authority belongs to duration. The Sumerian texts make this clear not through explanation, but through silence. The gods simply stop appearing as often, and nothing breaks. The world continues. Order holds. This silence is not absence. It is confirmation that the system works. Earth continues to consume effort. Gravity still pulls. Time still accumulates. By withdrawing physically, the gods avoid being consumed by the world they govern. Authority, unlike bodies, is not worn down by duration. It persists as long as it is recognized and reenacted. As the narrative moves forward, this distance will deepen further. Authority will be exercised almost entirely through intermediaries. Humans will become not just labourers, but administrators of divine order. What began as delegation becomes replacement of presence entirely. Not replacement of power, but of form. The gods do not vanish, they become background. And background, in a system meant to endure, is where authority lasts the longest. Earth has not expelled them. It has made presence inefficient. Authority answers that inefficiency by stepping in where bodies once stood. And so, the story continues, quieter now, more structured, shaped by a recognition that power does not always need to be seen to be absolute. As authority settles into structure and physical presence recedes, the Sumerian texts reveal something even more fundamental beneath every decision, every delegation, every withdrawal. Earth itself is not a stable backdrop. It is a system, and that system never remains balanced on its own. It requires constant adjustment, constant attention, constant correction. This understanding runs quietly through the entire tradition, shaping how the gods act, how humans labour, and why nothing is ever allowed to remain unattended for long. The Sumerians did not imagine Earth as a self-regulating mechanism that would naturally return to harmony if left alone. They experienced the opposite. Left unmanaged, rivers flooded unpredictably or dried out. Fields turned to dust or mud. Cities decayed. Order dissolved quickly. Balance was not the default state. Balance was something that had to be imposed again and again. This perception applies not only to human society but to the planet itself. Earth is productive, but volatile. Fertile, but unstable. It offers abundance only when guided. This is why the earliest divine actions focus on separation, boundary making and regulation. Heaven is lifted away from earth. Waters are divided. Domains are assigned. None of this happens once and then ends. It must be maintained. The text repeatedly returned to the idea of management. Canals are dug and redug. Embankments are repaired. Rituals are repeated. Offerings are renewed. These repetitions are not ceremonial excess. They are corrective actions. Without them, the system drifts toward disorder. This is where Earth differs from the heavens and the underworld. The sky follows predictable paths. Stars move in fixed patterns. The underworld remains static. Earth alone changes constantly. It erodes. It floods. It accumulates silt. It supports life that multiplies and exhausts resources. It demands attention. The gods, early on, engage directly with this demand. They intervene. They organize. They impose systems to keep Earth within tolerable bounds. But as time passes, the sheer persistence of this requirement becomes clear. Earth does not stabilize permanently. It never reaches a final perfected state. This realization drives much of what follows in the narrative. Delegation is not merely about reducing labor. It is about creating a feedback system that can respond continuously. Humans become part of this system because the gods cannot and will not perform endless corrections themselves. The creation of humans in this context is less about innovation and more about necessity. Earth needs constant adjustment. Adjustment requires hands. Hands require bodies adapted to Earth's conditions. Humans fill that role. But even with human labour, the system remains fragile. The texts emphasize ritual precision for a reason. Incorrect offerings disrupt balance. Neglected festivals lead to disorder. Improper behaviour offends not because it is immoral, but because it destabilises the system. This worldview reframes divine anger entirely. Anger is not emotional volatility, it is response to imbalance. When things go wrong, it is because the system has drifted too far from equilibrium. Correction follows. The flood narrative is the most extreme example of this logic. The world has become too noisy, too active, too dense. Adjustment through incremental measures has failed. A full reset becomes necessary. This is not framed as moral judgment. It is framed as system maintenance. After the flood, the gods impose stricter controls. Lifespans shorten. Population growth is limited. These are not acts of cruelty. They are constraints designed to prevent the system from reaching another breaking point. The earth after the flood is not kinder. It is more tightly managed. The margin for error is smaller. Balance must be maintained within narrower limits. The Anunnaki's role within this framework becomes clearer here. They are associated with fate, decree, and judgment, because these are tools of regulation. Fate fixes outcomes. Judgment resolves instability. Their authority operates at the level of system parameters rather than daily fluctuations. The texts rarely describe the Anunnaki intervening in small events. They are invoked when thresholds are crossed, when a life ends, when a destiny is sealed. These are boundary moments, not ongoing processes. This division reflects an understanding of scale. Earth requires constant small adjustments. Humans perform these. Gods oversee the boundaries. They set limits. They define what cannot be crossed. This layered management allows the system to function. Without it, Earth would overwhelm everything upon it. With it, order persists, but only through effort. The Sumerians did not imagine a future where Earth would no longer need correction. There is no final harmony. There is no end to maintenance. Even the gods accept this. This acceptance explains why physical presence becomes unsustainable. A being that intervenes constantly in an unstable system will be consumed by it. Fatigue accumulates. Time accelerates. Decline follows. Authority, by contrast, allows adjustment without immersion. Decrees shape behaviour without direct action. Laws guide labour without constant supervision. Ritual schedules correction in advance. This is not detachment, it is survival. The temple, as described earlier, is one component of this adjustment system. It anchors authority, it channels offerings, it regulates interaction, but it does not replace labour. It coordinates it. Kingship is another component. The king stands between divine authority and human effort. He enforces order. He mobilises labour. He responds to crisis. His legitimacy depends on divine sanction, but his work is earthly. This arrangement acknowledges Earth's nature. The planet cannot be ruled from a distance alone, nor can it be ruled through constant presence. It requires intermediaries. The texts emphasize this again and again through administrative detail. Lists, laws, ritual instructions, calendars. These are tools for managing a system that never rests. Time itself becomes an adjustment factor. Festivals realign divine and human cycles. Agricultural calendars synchronize labour with seasons. Everything is timed to reduce waste and strain. The gods do not fight Earth. They work with its patterns. They accept its cycles and impose structure around them. This cooperation is not equal. Earth remains indifferent, but it is effective. What emerges is a worldview where stability is artificial. It must be built, reinforced, and defended constantly. Collapse is always possible. The gods know this. Humans experience it. This shared vulnerability binds the system together. Humans labour because without labour, the world collapses. The gods oversee because without oversight, labour loses direction. The Anunnaki's judgments ensure that boundaries hold, that death remains final, that fate remains fixed. Without these constants, the system would unravel. Earth's demand for constant adjustment explains why the gods do not return to full presence later. The cost is too high. The system works better when authority governs from above and below, not from within. This does not mean Earth has won. It means Earth has revealed the terms of existence. Anyone who remains must accept them. The Sumerians did not imagine themselves as masters of the planet. They imagined themselves as caretakers within a fragile order, supported by divine structure and constrained by natural reality. The gods, likewise, are not conquerors of Earth. They are regulators of it. They do not transform its nature. They manage its consequences. This perspective strips away later fantasies of effortless domination. What remains is a sober understanding of endurance. Earth is not defeated. It is negotiated with endlessly. And because it never settles, neither can those who govern it. Adjustment must continue. Delegation must deepen. Distance must increase. As the narrative moves forward, this relentless need for correction will push the system toward its final transformation. Long stays will become untenable. Presence will give way almost entirely to absence, not because the gods are gone, but because the system they built can now run without them being exposed to its endless demands. Earth remains active, humans remain busy, authority remains intact. What changes is how close the gods can afford to be, and that realization leads directly into the next stage, where remaining too long is no longer an option, and withdrawal becomes not a choice, but a requirement. As the Sumerian texts continue beyond the point where Earth is clearly understood as a system requiring constant adjustment, a deeper realization begins to take shape. It is never stated outright, never framed as a confession or a failure. Instead, it emerges through consequence, through pattern, through what stops happening. Long stays, once assumed, become rare. Sustained presence becomes exceptional. What had once been possible is no longer viable. This is not because the gods lose authority. It is because authority no longer depends on remaining. In the earliest imagination, divine presence on Earth is taken for granted. The gods act here. They dwell here. They shape the land directly. But as time accumulates and systems mature, the cost of staying becomes increasingly clear. Earth does not reward endurance with ease. It responds with accumulation. The longer one remains embedded within its cycles, the more those cycles assert themselves. Gravity never relents. Air never stops pressing. Sound never ceases. Time never pauses. These forces do not weaken those who pass briefly through. They shape those who stay. The texts reflect this understanding not through lament but through adjustment. Presence becomes temporary. Visits replace residence. Intervention replaces involvement. And eventually even intervention becomes rare. This is where the idea of unsustainability enters the narrative, not as a dramatic collapse, but as a quiet conclusion drawn from experience. The gods have learned what Earth requires. They have learned what it takes to remain, and they have learned what it costs. Long stays mean continuous exposure. Exposure means fatigue. Fatigue leads to error. Error destabilizes the system. For beings tasked with maintaining order, this risk becomes unacceptable. The Sumerians did not imagine their gods as reckless. They imagined them as pragmatic. When a strategy no longer works, it is abandoned. Not out of defeat, but out of wisdom. The evidence of this appears everywhere in the later texts. Direct encounters diminish. Stories of gods walking openly among humans fade into the past. New generations know the gods through ritual, law, and memory rather than sight. This is not portrayed as loss. It is portrayed as normal. The Anunnaki in particular exemplify this shift. They are never described as maintaining prolonged surface presence. Their authority operates through decree, through fate, through judgment. These are actions that do not require location. They do not benefit from proximity. In fact, proximity would undermine them. A judge must be removed from the noise of the crowd. A determiner of fate must not be entangled in daily fluctuation. Long stays would compromise the very function the Anunnaki serve. The texts reflect this logic consistently. When divine figures are associated with constant surface activity, they experience strain. When they withdraw into defined domains, stability improves. This withdrawal is not abandonment of responsibility. It is refinement of it. Earth's surface is dynamic, too dynamic. It changes faster than authority can react if that authority is fully embedded. Crops fail suddenly. Floods arrive without warning. Cities grow and collapse. Noise increases. Population density rises. These are not problems that can be solved through constant presence alone. They require systems that can operate independently. Long stays tie authority to immediacy. Immediacy creates vulnerability. A god who must respond to every fluctuation becomes reactive. Reactivity leads to exhaustion. Exhaustion undermines judgment. Distance restores clarity. The Sumerian texts show this through narrative pacing. Early myths are full of action. Later compositions are full of instruction. Laws replace stories. Lists replace encounters. Procedures replace appearances. This is not literary decline. It is structural evolution. Long stays also blur boundaries. When gods remain too close to humans for too long, distinctions erode. Noise becomes intolerable. Expectations increase. Demands multiply. Humans begin to treat divine presence as ordinary rather than exceptional. This is dangerous for both sides. The flood narrative captures this tension perfectly. Human success overwhelms the system. The gods are disturbed not because humans are evil, but because they are everywhere. Too present, too active. The world becomes saturated. The solution is not permanent destruction. It is separation. Limits are imposed. Lifespans shorten. Growth is regulated. And crucially, divine presence retreats. This retreat ensures that proximity does not return to unsustainable levels. The Sumerians understood that closeness carries cost. Familiarity breeds strain. Distance restores reverence and order. Long stays also create dependency. When gods remain present continuously, humans rely on them for immediate correction. Responsibility weakens. Initiative diminishes. Delegation becomes meaningless if authority never steps back. Withdrawal forces humans to carry more weight. This is not cruelty. It is necessary for the system to function without constant divine intervention. Earth itself demands this outcome. Its instability requires constant local management. Humans are better suited to this because they are adapted to the environment. They are born into it. They age within it. They expect its demands. The gods, by contrast, originate outside this rhythm. Prolonged exposure imposes costs that outweigh the benefits of staying. The texts do not frame this as incompatibility in essence. They frame it as incompatibility in duration. Short-term presence is manageable. Long-term residence is not. This distinction matters. It allows divine authority to remain intact while explaining reduced visibility. The gods have not left because they were driven out. They have stepped back because staying no longer serves their function. The Anunnaki's continued role after withdrawal reinforces this point. They remain active, they remain authoritative, they remain essential. But they operate from domains where time moves differently, where noise does not intrude, where judgment can remain stable. Earth's surface becomes increasingly human. This is not a loss for the gods, it is a resolution. The system they established no longer requires their constant involvement. This realization also reshapes how memory functions. Stories of early closeness are preserved as ancient history. They are not expected to repeat. The past becomes instructive rather than aspirational. The Sumerians do not pray for the gods to return permanently. They pray for favor, protection, fertility, order. These do not require constant presence. They require authority. Authority endures best when it is not exhausted. Long stays, then, are unsustainable not because the gods are weak, but because the world is relentless. Earth does not adjust itself to prolong divine habitation. It consumes effort without regard for status. The gods respond by changing how they exist within the system. They move upward and downward, away from the surface, into roles that preserve clarity. This shift also explains why later cultures inherit divine structures without inheriting divine presence. The system is designed to outlast those who created it. That is its strength. The Sumerian worldview is not nostalgic about this. It does not long for a return to an earlier age. It accepts the present arrangement as appropriate. The world has matured. Authority has adapted. Humans have taken their place. Earth continues to demand adjustment. Humans now absorb most of that demand. The gods oversee from positions that do not require endurance of constant strain. Long stays are no longer necessary. They are no longer desirable. They are no longer efficient. And so presence fades not into absence but into distance. The gods are still there. The Anunnaki still judge. Fate is still fixed. Order still holds. What has changed is the understanding that staying too long in a world that never adapts in return is not a mark of power, but a misunderstanding of how power endures. Earth has taught this lesson patiently, over centuries, over floods and harvests, over noise and silence. Those who listened adjusted, those who adjusted endured, and from that endurance comes the next step, where withdrawal is no longer gradual but deliberate, and absence becomes the final strategy for remaining in control without being consumed. The withdrawal described in the Sumerian text does not arrive with drama. There is no final battle, no collapse of heaven, no moment where the world breaks and forces the gods to flee. Nothing in the record suggests panic or defeat. Instead, withdrawal unfolds as a decision shaped by experience, carried out quietly and accepted as necessary. It is one of the most easily misunderstood aspects of the tradition, precisely because later storytelling so often expects catastrophe to explain absence. In the Sumerian worldview, withdrawal is not failure, it is control exercised at a distance. By the time the text reached this stage, the conditions have already been established. Earth is demanding, presence is costly, long stays strain both authority and endurance, delegation has redistributed labour. Systems have been built that can function without constant divine intervention. Nothing essential depends on physical proximity anymore. Withdrawal becomes possible because it is safe. This is why the texts never describe a moment of departure in the way later myths describe exile or banishment. There is no language of being driven out. There is no enemy. There is no force that overwhelms the gods. Earth has not risen up. Humanity has not rebelled successfully. The gods are not escaping danger. They are reducing exposure. The absence of catastrophe is itself the evidence. The world does not collapse when divine presence recedes. Cities continue. Kings rule. Fields are planted and harvested. Laws are enforced. Rituals are performed. The system holds. That is the point. A retreat under pressure leaves damage behind. A withdrawal from strength does not. The Sumerian texts consistently show that when divine figures act under duress, the results are destructive. Floods, plagues, sudden reversals. But withdrawal is not accompanied by these signs. It happens during stability, not crisis. This tells us something about intent. The gods withdraw because they can, not because they must. This distinction matters. If withdrawal were defeat, authority would fracture, competing powers would emerge, chaos would follow, but the texts show the opposite. Authority becomes more centralized. Fate becomes more fixed. Law becomes more detailed. Distance strengthens structure. The Anunnaki, whose authority persists after withdrawal, are proof of this. They do not vanish. They do not lose relevance. Their judgments continue to shape outcomes. Their role becomes clearer, not weaker. This would not be possible if withdrawal were the result of catastrophe. Instead, withdrawal appears as the final refinement of governance. Once systems are stable, once humans can maintain surface order, once boundaries are fixed, physical presence becomes redundant. Redundancy is wasteful. Waste invites strain. The gods have already learned this lesson through fatigue, through noise, through imbalance. Withdrawal is the logical conclusion of everything that came before. It is also selective. Not all gods withdraw in the same way or to the same degree. Those associated with creation and surface activity recede first. Those associated with judgment and fate remain engaged, but from domains insulated from surface chaos. This is not abandonment, it is redistribution. The heavens and the underworld become primary domains not because Earth is rejected, but because Earth has been stabilized enough to be left alone. These realms offer conditions that do not accelerate strain. They are quieter, more regular, less demanding. Withdrawal, then, is not disappearance. It is repositioning. The texts reflect this through silence rather than statement. We are not told that the gods leave. We are shown that they stop appearing. The narrative continues without them needing to walk among humans. This absence is not explained because it does not need explanation within the worldview. It is the natural outcome of a system that has matured. Later generations inherit a world where divine presence is mediated. They do not question why gods no longer wander freely. They accept that gods rule through law, ritual and memory. This acceptance is itself evidence that withdrawal was successful. If withdrawal had been traumatic, it would have been remembered as such. The Sumerians were meticulous record keepers. They documented disasters in detail. They preserved flood stories, plagues, collapses. The lack of such a record regarding divine withdrawal is telling. Instead, what we see is normalization. The divine becomes background, ever present in authority, rarely present in body. This is not loss, it is efficiency. Withdrawal also protects the gods from the one thing they cannot fully control: accumulation. Earth accumulates everything. Silt builds up, cities grow dense, noise multiplies, time accelerates. Remaining embedded within this accumulation eventually erodes clarity. Distance halts that process. By withdrawing, the gods preserve their ability to judge impartially. They avoid being overwhelmed by immediacy. They step out of the stream of constant reaction and into a position where decisions can be fixed rather than improvised. The Anunnaki's enduring role makes sense only in this context. As determiners of fate, they must not be reactive. Fate cannot be revised constantly. Withdrawal ensures stability. This is why the underworld is not portrayed as a place of punishment for the gods. It is portrayed as a realm of order, a place where things remain as they are set, a place where judgment stands. This suits beings whose authority depends on consistency. Earth, by contrast, is volatile. It demands endless correction. Withdrawal does not mean abandoning that correction. It means letting human systems absorb most of it. Kings enforce law, priests perform rituals, farmers manage land, scribes record transactions. All of this continues without divine bodies moving through the streets. Authority flows through institutions instead. This arrangement is more resilient than one based on presence. If a god must appear to maintain order, order fails the moment that God is absent. If authority is embedded in systems, it persists regardless of presence. The Sumerian texts clearly favour the second model. Withdrawal is not the end of divine involvement. It is the transition to a form of involvement that cannot be exhausted. The lack of catastrophe also tells us that humans were not resisting this change. There is no record of panic at divine absence, no accounts of collapse due to abandonment. Humans adapt quickly to the mediated relationship because it works. The gods are still honoured, offerings continue, festivals are observed. The relationship persists, simply altered in form. This acceptance reflects the Sumerian understanding of order. Order does not depend on constant supervision. It depends on proper structure. Once structure is in place, supervision can recede. Withdrawal without defeat also explains why later cultures inherit divine names and functions without inheriting stories of departure. The gods are simply no longer there in the old way. No explanation is needed because no rupture occurred. Earth did not reject the gods. The gods did not abandon Earth. They recalibrated their involvement. This recalibration preserves dignity on both sides. There is no humiliation, no blame, just adjustment. The Sumerians were comfortable with this idea because it mirrored their own experience. Elders withdraw from daily labour but retain authority. Kings delegate but remain sovereign. Builders step back once a structure stands. Withdrawal is not weakness, it is completion. The gods behave as successful builders behave. They leave the structure standing. This perspective challenges later narratives that frame divine absence as loss or punishment. In the Sumerian record, absence is the sign that things are working as intended. The world continues. That is the proof. The rivers still flood. Crops still grow. Cities still rise and fall. Laws still govern behaviour. Fate still unfolds. None of this requires gods walking openly among humans. Withdrawal allows the gods to endure beyond the lifespan of any single civilization. Presence ties authority to place and time. Distance allows it to persist. This is why withdrawal is careful, gradual and unremarkable. It does not announce itself because it is not meant to be noticed as an event. It is meant to be lived as a condition. The Anunnaki remain relevant precisely because they are no longer exposed to surface volatility. Their judgments stand across generations. Their decrees outlast kings. Their authority survives cultural change. Earth remains what it has always been, demanding, indifferent, unstable. Humans adapt to it daily. The gods no longer need to. Withdrawal is not an ending. It is a stabilization of relationship. And because it is not tied to catastrophe, it leaves no scar in the record. Only silence. Only distance. Only a world that continues to function under laws that no longer require their authors to be present. This sets the stage for what follows, where absence becomes normal, memory becomes primary, and what the texts no longer describe becomes just as important as what they still preserve. The gods have not lost. They have stepped aside, and Earth, unchanged, continues to do what it has always done, indifferent to who remains upon it, while authority holds from a place no longer consumed by its endless demands. As the withdrawal settles into normality, the most revealing evidence does not lie in what the Sumerian texts continue to describe, but in what quietly disappears from the record. There is no announcement of omission, no statement that certain things will no longer be spoken of. The change is detected only by comparison. Earlier layers are rich with immediacy, motion, encounter. Later layers are not. The absence itself becomes a form of testimony. The texts stop describing movement. In the earliest traditions, gods travel. They go from place to place. They arrive. They depart. They cross boundaries between domains with relative ease. Their presence is marked by motion through the world. This motion is never dramatized as spectacle, but it is assumed. Over time, however, such descriptions thin out. Gods are no longer said to walk among cities. They are no longer encountered on roads or in fields. The narrative no longer expects mobility as part of divine life. Instead, location becomes fixed. A god is associated with a temple, a city, a domain. Movement is replaced by attribution. Rather than describing where a god goes, the texts describe where a god belongs. This shift is subtle but decisive. Belonging implies permanence. It also implies stillness. The texts also stop describing direct instruction. Earlier compositions include moments where divine figures speak directly to humans, explaining tasks, correcting errors. giving immediate guidance. These exchanges are not framed as extraordinary. They are part of how the world functions. As withdrawal progresses, this kind of interaction fades. Guidance becomes indirect. Instructions are preserved as tradition rather than delivered as conversation. Law codes appear. Ritual instructions are written down. Calendars are fixed. These are durable forms of guidance. They do not require presence. Once established, they can be followed indefinitely. The gods no longer need to speak because their will has already been encoded. The texts stop describing divine improvisation. Early myths are full of adjustment. Gods react to situations. They change plans. They argue. They reverse decisions. Over time, this dynamism recedes. Decisions appear settled. Decrees are final. Fate, once fixed, unfolds without revision. This reflects distance. A being embedded in immediacy must improvise. A being governing from afar can decide once and allow consequences to follow. The Anunnaki, as determiners of fate, exemplify this change. They do not intervene repeatedly. They do not revisit judgments. Their authority rests precisely in the fact that what they decide remains unchanged. The texts reflect this by describing outcomes rather than deliberations. The texts stop describing divine fatigue explicitly. Earlier passages include complaint. Gods speak of labour. They express weariness. They seek relief. These expressions become rarer as withdrawal takes effect, not because fatigue has vanished, but because the conditions that caused it have been removed. Distance solves what endurance could not. Once presence recedes, fatigue no longer needs to be mentioned. Silence replaces complaint. This silence is not ignorance. It is resolution. The texts stop describing shared space. In early narratives, gods and humans occupy overlapping environments. They attend the same locations. They share the surface world. Over time, spatial separation becomes assumed. Humans remain on Earth's surface. Gods reside elsewhere. Interaction occurs at boundaries rather than within shared space. Temples become thresholds rather than dwellings. Rituals mark points of contact rather than continuous presence. The texts no longer imagine gods lingering among ordinary human activity. This is not because the gods are gone, but because proximity is no longer the norm. The texts stop describing surprise. Early encounters carry unpredictability. A god appears unexpectedly. An event interrupts routine. As authority becomes institutional, surprise diminishes. Divine action is anticipated through ritual calendars. Omens are interpreted. Signs are read. Nothing arrives without context. This predictability is not boredom. It is stability. A system that has matured does not rely on interruption to assert authority. It relies on expectation. The texts stop describing beginnings. Creation stories remain, but they are treated as distant past. They are no longer expanded. No new creation events are added. The world is assumed complete. Attention shifts to maintenance rather than origin. This reflects a worldview that has moved beyond formation into endurance. The gods are no longer builders. They are custodians. Custodians do not create anew. They preserve. The texts stop describing the gods as learners. Early narratives include moments of discovery. The gods encounter consequences. They adjust behaviour. Later texts assume that these lessons have already been learned. Policies are in place. Limits are enforced. There is little trial and error. This suggests that learning has concluded, at least regarding Earth. Withdrawal marks the point at which further learning through exposure is no longer necessary or desired. The texts stop describing intimacy. There is no language of closeness, familiarity, or shared daily life. The relationship becomes formal. Respect replaces familiarity. Awe replaces conversation. This does not weaken devotion. It reshapes it. Awe functions better at distance. Familiarity breeds expectation. Expectation leads to demand. Demand increases strain. The system avoids this by removing intimacy from its design. The texts stop describing divine vulnerability. Earlier stories include moments where gods are threatened, distressed, or placed in difficult situations. As presence recedes, vulnerability disappears from the narrative. The gods are no longer shown at risk because they are no longer exposed. Authority expressed through structure does not bleed. This absence of vulnerability reinforces legitimacy. A ruler who cannot be harmed cannot be destabilized. Withdrawal protects authority by removing it from immediate danger. The texts stop describing the gods as neighbours. They are no longer part of the landscape. They are above it or below it. They are referenced, not encountered. This vertical separation aligns with everything that has come before. The surface is demanding. The domains away from it are not. The heavens and the underworld become places of permanence. Earth becomes a place of activity. The division is clean. The texts stop describing the possibility of return. There is no anticipation that gods will once again walk freely among humans as they once did. That era is treated as closed, not forbidden, but finished. The past is not a model for the future, it is a lesson. This is one of the most significant silences. Cultures that expect return speak of it constantly. They anticipate restoration. The Sumerian texts do not. They accept the present arrangement as correct. The gods have not promised to come back. They have arranged to remain distant. The texts stop describing novelty. Later compositions focus on repetition. Rituals repeat. Laws are enforced again and again. Festivals recur annually. This repetition is the hallmark of a system designed to endure. Novelty is destabilizing. Withdrawal allows stability to replace innovation. Earth does not reward novelty. It rewards consistency. Agriculture depends on it. Governance depends on it. Authority depends on it. The texts stop describing divine frustration with Earth itself. Earlier passages include moments where the gods respond sharply to environmental disruption. Later texts focus on regulation rather than reaction. The system has adapted to Earth's volatility. Adjustment mechanisms are in place. Crisis becomes manageable. This suggests that the gods no longer experience Earth as overwhelming. Distance has solved the problem. The texts stop describing divine speech as dialogue. Speech becomes proclamation. Hymns praise. Prayers petition. There is no back and forth. Communication is directional. This reinforces hierarchy and reduces unpredictability. Dialogue implies equality of space. Proclamation does not. The texts stop describing divine curiosity about humanity. Humans become predictable. Their roles are defined. Their behavior is regulated. The gods no longer observe them with interest. They monitor them through law and ritual. Curiosity is replaced by administration. This is not disdain. It is efficiency. The accumulation of these absences forms a pattern. The gods have not vanished. They have refined their presence to the point where description itself is unnecessary. Their influence is assumed. What remains in the texts is structure, order, procedure, memory. These do not require bodies. They require authority. Earth continues to demand effort. Humans provide it. Kings organize it. Priests sanctify it. Scribes record it. The gods oversee from positions where their endurance is no longer tested by constant exposure. The silence that follows withdrawal is not emptiness. It is the sound of a system working. This is why later generations inherit gods who feel distant but powerful. The distance is intentional. It is the result of long experience, not abandonment. The texts do not grieve what they stop describing. They do not attempt to recover it. They move forward as if the change were inevitable, because within their worldview it was. The gods did not leave in anger. They did not flee. They did not disappear. They simply stopped needing to be present in ways that cost them too much. Earth has not been transformed. It remains unstable, demanding, indifferent. Humans have taken on the role of absorbing that instability. Authority has repositioned itself where it can endure. What the texts stop describing is not loss, it is completion. And because this completion leaves no rupture, no catastrophe, no final act, it is easy to miss. Only careful attention to absence reveals it. What follows, then, is a world where memory carries more weight than experience, where stories replace encounters, and where the divine is felt not through presence, but through the persistence of order. The gods remain, but they remain differently, and that difference shapes everything that comes next. As direct interaction fades from the record, something else grows steadily in its place. It is not silence, and it is not ignorance. It is memory. The Sumerian texts increasingly rely on remembrance rather than encounter, on preservation rather than experience. This transition is not framed as loss. It is framed as continuity achieved through different means. Memory, in this context, is not personal recollection. It is collective structure. It is what remains when presence is no longer necessary. The gods no longer speak face to face, but their words endure. They no longer appear in daily life, but their actions are remembered, recorded, and reenacted. Memory becomes the medium through which authority persists. The texts reflect this shift through their form as much as their content. Early narratives emphasize events unfolding in real time. Later compositions emphasize what has already been established. Laws are copied, hymns are repeated, ritual instructions are preserved word for word. This is not stagnation, it is stabilization. Direct interaction requires proximity. Proximity carries risk, misunderstanding, offense, exhaustion. Memory eliminates these risks by fixing meaning in durable form. A law does not argue. A ritual does not change its mind. A hymn does not improvise. These qualities make memory reliable in a way presence never was. The Sumerians understood this deeply. They did not treat memory as a weaker substitute for experience. They treated it as a superior mechanism for long-term order. Experience is fleeting. Memory can be transmitted across generations. This is why scribes become so important in later texts. Writing is not merely record-keeping, it is preservation of divine will. To copy a text correctly is to maintain order. Error is dangerous because it alters memory. Altered memory destabilizes authority. The gods in this system do not need to correct mistakes personally. Memory does that work for them. A preserved instruction continues to guide behavior long after the moment of its origin has passed. Ritual functions the same way. A ritual reenacts a past interaction without requiring its repetition. It creates continuity without presence. The gods are honoured not because they appear, but because their past actions are remembered and reaffirmed. This is a crucial distinction. Memory does not summon the gods back into the world. It allows the world to function without summoning them. The Anunnaki's role fits naturally into this framework. As determiners of fate, they do not need to interact continuously. Fate, once set, unfolds. Memory ensures that the structure governing fate remains intact. The underworld itself operates as a memory space. It holds what has ended, it preserves what cannot return. This aligns with the Anunnaki's function. They do not participate in daily life. They stand at the boundary where life becomes memory. Human life, by contrast, is increasingly defined by remembrance. Ancestors are honoured, kings are listed, events are dated. History emerges as a discipline because direct access to the divine has ended. Memory must now carry what presence once provided. This does not weaken belief, it strengthens it. Belief rooted in memory is less volatile than belief rooted in encounter. Encounters can be disputed, memories can be standardized. The Sumerian texts show a growing concern with accuracy. Proper names must be preserved. Lineages must be correct. Ritual words must not change. This concern reflects the new burden placed on memory. It is now the primary conduit of divine authority. The temple remains central to this process. It is not merely a place of worship, it is an archive. Hymns are stored, ritual knowledge is guarded, calendars are maintained. The temple ensures that memory does not drift. Priests become custodians rather than intermediaries. They do not speak for the gods spontaneously. They preserve what has already been said. Their authority lies in fidelity, not inspiration. This is a significant shift. Earlier figures receive messages directly. Later figures inherit them. Revelation gives way to transmission. The Sumerians did not see this as a decline in divine communication. They saw it as maturation. A system that depends on constant revelation is unstable. A system that relies on preserved instruction can endure. Memory also allows authority to scale. A God who speaks directly can reach only those present. A God whose will is written can govern across cities, generations, and cultures. Distance no longer limits influence. This explains why divine names and functions persist long after direct interaction has ceased. Memory keeps them alive, not as living beings walking among humans, but as forces shaping behaviour through inherited structure. The text reinforced this by emphasizing tradition. What was done before must be done again. Innovation is suspect. Stability comes from repetition. Repetition strengthens memory. Earth's role in this transformation is indirect but decisive. The environment does not support constant interaction. It is too demanding. Memory reduces the need for presence and therefore reduces exposure. Humans, adapted to Earth, take on the work of remembering. They record, recite, and reenact. This labour replaces the physical labour once performed by the gods. It is lighter in one sense, heavier in another. Memory requires discipline. Forgetting becomes dangerous. A forgotten ritual is not merely a mistake. It is a rupture in continuity. The gods no longer appear to correct it. The system depends on human precision. This places responsibility squarely on human society. Order is no longer enforced through fear of immediate divine reaction. It is maintained through commitment to inherited forms. The Sumerians accepted this responsibility. They built institutions around it, schools for scribes, archives for tablets, calendars for festivals. These are not signs of decline. They are signs of confidence. A world that remembers does not need constant supervision. Direct interaction, by contrast, becomes rare and symbolic. When gods appear in later texts, it is usually in dreams or omens. These are mediated experiences. They do not disrupt daily life. They guide rather than intervene. Dreams and omens fit perfectly into a memory-based system. They do not replace instruction. They reinforce it. They remind rather than redefine. The Anunnaki's judgments are remembered through outcomes rather than appearances. A life ends, a dynasty falls, a fate unfolds. These events confirm authority without requiring explanation. Memory also protects the gods from misunderstanding. Presence invites interpretation. Absence allows definition. The gods become what the texts say they are, not what an encounter might suggest. This reduces variability. It ensures consistency across regions and generations. Authority becomes standardized. The Sumerians did not imagine this process as temporary. They did not expect direct interaction to return as a norm. Memory was not a placeholder. It was the solution. The shift from presence to memory also reshapes emotion. Fear becomes reverence. Familiarity becomes formality. These emotional changes support stability. They discourage excess. A god remembered is harder to offend accidentally than a god encountered unexpectedly. Memory creates safe distance. This distance does not sever relationship. It clarifies it. Humans know what is expected. The gods know that order will persist without their constant involvement. Earth continues to demand labour. Humans provide it. Memory ensures that labour aligns with divine structure. What once required proximity now requires fidelity. This is why later texts are less vivid but more precise. They trade immediacy for endurance. They sacrifice encounter for continuity. The gods accept this trade because it allows them to remain authoritative without being consumed by the world they ordered. Memory becomes the bridge between realms. It carries the past into the present without reopening it. It allows authority to persist without returning. The Sumerian worldview is remarkably comfortable with this outcome. It does not romanticize the age of direct interaction. It does not promise its return. It moves forward. The gods are still honoured. Their names are still spoken, their decisions still matter. But they matter through memory rather than presence. This is not a lesser form of divinity. It is a sustainable one. As the narrative continues, this reliance on memory will deepen further. What remains of the gods will be increasingly abstract. Their influence will be felt through legacy rather than action. And Earth, unchanged, will continue to press upon those who live upon it, while those who no longer need to endure its weight remain where memory alone is sufficient to keep them present. What follows is the final stage of this process, where even memory itself becomes selective, and the world that remains after them carries their imprint without requiring their return. After withdrawal settles into permanence and memory replaces into action, the texts begin to reveal something that is both quiet and unsettling. Earth does not react, it does not soften, it does not commemorate what has changed. It continues exactly as it always has. The departure of sustained divine presence leaves no visible mark on the planet itself. Rivers still flood, seasons still turn, crops still fail and succeed. The land remains indifferent. This indifference is one of the most consistent and least remarked upon features of the Sumerian worldview. Earth is never portrayed as grateful for order, nor resentful of abandonment. It does not acknowledge the gods' labour. It does not mourn their distance. It simply persists. The texts do not describe any moment where the land becomes easier after the gods withdraw. There is no golden age of effortless abundance. Human labour does not lighten. Floods do not cease. Droughts do not disappear. The planet behaves as it always has, demanding constant attention from those who remain upon it. This is not framed as punishment. It is framed as reality. The Sumerians understood that Earth does not remember. Memory belongs to beings, not to systems. The planet does not carry gratitude or resentment. It carries processes. These processes continue regardless of who oversees them. Even after the gods step back, canals still require clearing. Fields still require tending. Cities still decay if neglected. Earth does not preserve order on its own. The absence of divine presence does not reduce the work required to maintain balance. This reveals something essential about why withdrawal was possible. The gods were never holding Earth together through presence alone. They established systems. Once those systems existed, Earth did not require them to remain physically involved. It required labour, but not divinity. Humans absorb this labour without expecting the planet to change in response. They do not pray for Earth to become kinder. They pray for favour, rain, fertility, protection. They know the land itself will not adapt. The texts consistently separate Earth from moral narrative. Floods are destructive, but not evil. Droughts are devastating, but not malicious. Earth is not an actor with intent. It is a condition. This distinction becomes clearer after withdrawal. When disasters occur, they are no longer described as divine appearances. They are outcomes, consequences, events that unfold within an established system. The gods may have sanctioned boundaries, but Earth executes them without judgment. This reinforces the need for human responsibility. Without divine presence to intervene, humans must anticipate Earth's behaviour. They must plan for floods, store grain, reinforce walls, adjust calendars. Earth will not warn them. It will simply act. The Anunnaki's judgments still matter, but they operate at a different level. Fate determines when life ends. when kingdoms fall, when cycles close. Earth handles the details. The surface world remains governed by natural forces that do not negotiate. This separation clarifies the final balance of roles. The gods establish limits. Earth enforces conditions. Humans navigate between them. The texts never suggest that Earth resents the gods' withdrawal, nor do they suggest that Earth becomes hostile in response. Indifference is the defining quality. The planet does not care who governs it. It responds only to physical reality. This is why Earth remains unchanged even as divine presence fades. The systems that matter to Earth are not authority and memory. They are water flow, soil composition, climate patterns, gravity. None of these respond to ritual or law. The Sumerians accepted this fully. They did not imagine that divine favour could override natural process entirely. Favour might bring rain, but it does not eliminate the need for canals. Protection might spare a city, but it does not halt erosion forever. Earth's indifference also explains why withdrawal does not reverse. If the planet had softened after the gods stepped back, there might have been reason to return, but nothing improved. The cost of presence remained high, the benefit diminished. Human societies continue to rise and fall under the same pressures as before. Cities expanded and collapsed. Empires formed and dissolved. Earth absorbed them all without distinction. The texts reflect this by maintaining the same tone toward the land before and after withdrawal. There is no shift in how Earth is described. It remains demanding, fertile, dangerous, essential. Divine distance does not change its nature. This constancy gives the narrative its final stability. Earth does not need to be explained anew. It is known. Its behaviour is predictable in its unpredictability. The gods, having learned this, no longer attempt to manage Earth directly. They allow it to be what it is. Their authority focuses on boundaries that Earth cannot enforce on its own, such as fate and judgment. Humans, adapted to Earth, carry the burden of daily interaction. They learn its moods. They respond to its cycles. They suffer its extremes. Earth does not become more humane. Humans become more experienced. The Sumerian worldview does not present this as tragic. It presents it as clarity. Earth was never meant to be ruled in the same way authority rules society. It must be worked with, endured, respected for its indifference. This perspective strips away later ideas of a fallen world or a cursed land. Earth is not fallen, it is consistent. The burden lies not in its nature, but in the expectations placed upon it. By the time divine presence has fully receded into memory and structure, Earth is revealed plainly for what it has always been. A system that does not care who oversees it. A surface that demands effort without offering relief. A foundation upon which life must constantly negotiate survival. The gods have not abandoned this world to chaos. They have left it to the only beings capable of living within its demands without being undone by them. Humans remain because they must. They are born into Earth's conditions. They expect nothing else. Their lives are shaped by limitation from the beginning. The gods, having learned what prolonged exposure costs, choose distance. Earth does not respond. It continues. The indifference is not cruel. It is impartial. It treats all presence the same, divine or mortal. Everything that remains is shaped by it. Everything that cannot endure withdraws. The texts do not dramatize this truth. They accept it quietly. Earth is not impressed by creation. It is not softened by order. It does not change because gods once walked upon it. What remains after them is exactly what existed before them, a world that must be managed continuously, without expectation of kindness. This is why memory becomes so important. Memory preserves what Earth does not. Earth erases footprints. Memory records them. Cities fall. Tablets remain. Rivers change course. Names endure. Earth consumes structures. Memory resists consumption. The gods remain present through memory because Earth does not keep them present through any other means. And so the final image left by the texts is not of an empty world, but of a busy one. Humans labour, kings rule, priests recite, scribes write. Earth continues to apply pressure. Nothing has been resolved. Nothing has been redeemed. The system persists. Earth remains unchanged and indifferent, exactly as it always was. And because it does not care who remains upon it, those who could leave did. What follows is not a return, not a reckoning, but a quiet inheritance. A world that carries the imprint of its architects without requiring their return. And with that, the narrative moves toward its final reflection, not on departure or presence, but on what it means for memory, authority, and humanity to persist in a world that never adapted to those who shaped it. As the narrative settles into its final stillness, there is no dramatic ending waiting to be delivered, no revelation meant to startle, no conclusion designed to resolve everything that came before. What remains instead is a quiet recognition, one that the Sumerian texts never state outright, but consistently imply. If even gods could not stay, then endurance itself becomes the central mystery, not power. The idea that divine beings withdrew does not diminish them. It reframes the world. Throughout the record, the gods are never portrayed as defeated by Earth. They are not chased away. They are not overcome by rebellion or catastrophe. They leave because staying no longer serves the purpose of order. That distinction matters. It tells us something not only about the gods, but about the nature of the world they engaged with. Earth does not reward presence. It absorbs it. Everything that remains long enough within it is shaped, worn, altered. Rivers cut through stone. Wind smooths mountains. Cities crumble back into soil. Nothing is exempt. The Sumerians understood this not as tragedy, but as fact. The world is not cruel. It is consistent. The gods, for all their authority, are not portrayed as exceptions to this consistency. Their power lies in recognition, in structure, in decree, not in immunity from consequence. When presence becomes costly, wisdom lies in adaptation, not resistance. This is where the quiet weight of the story rests. If beings of immense power chose distance over endurance, then endurance itself is not the highest form of strength. Sustainability is. The Sumerian worldview does not celebrate endless struggle. It values balance. It values knowing when to act, when to withdraw, and when to allow systems to carry forward what no longer needs direct involvement. Humans inherit this world not because they are superior, but because they are suited to it. They are born into limitation. They expect gravity. They expect aging. They expect effort. Earth does not shock them because it has never promised ease. This difference matters. What overwhelms a god over long duration is simply life to a human. The texts do not present humanity as abandoned. They present humanity as entrusted. The gods step back only after systems are in place. Law exists, kingship exists, ritual exists, memory exists. The withdrawal happens when continuity no longer depends on presence. This is not neglect, it is completion. What it means then, if even gods could not stay, is not that the world is hostile to divinity. It is that the world is indifferent to identity. It treats everything the same. Power does not grant exemption. Only adaptation allows continuation. The gods adapt by distancing themselves. Humans adapt by enduring. Neither choice is framed as failure. Each is appropriate to the nature of the being making it. The Sumerians did not imagine a universe designed for comfort. They imagined one designed for persistence. Order is not guaranteed. It must be maintained. Balance is not permanent. It must be renewed. Presence is not sustainable forever. It must give way to structure. In this view, the gods are not lessened by absence. They become timeless precisely because they no longer need to participate in time the way humans do. Their authority stretches across generations because it is no longer bound to bodies or place. Humans, by contrast, become the ones who carry time forward. They age, they remember, they rebuild, they forget and relearn. Their role is not to escape Earth's demands, but to live within them. This arrangement is not portrayed as unjust. It is portrayed as fitting. The Sumerian texts never promise relief from the world. They offer understanding of it. They do not promise return of divine presence. They offer stability in its absence. That stability rests on acceptance. Acceptance that the world does not care who once shaped it. Acceptance that effort will always be required. Acceptance that memory matters more than proximity. What remains after the gods is not emptiness. It is continuity. Fields are still planted. Cities are still governed. Children are still born. Death still arrives. Earth continues to turn without acknowledgement of who once walked upon it. And yet, the imprint remains, in law, in ritual, in story, in the quiet repetition of actions performed the same way for generations. This is how present survives without returning. The Sumerians did not view this as loss of intimacy. They viewed it as the price of endurance. Intimacy is intense but fleeting. Structure is distant but lasting. If even gods could not stay, then perhaps staying was never the goal. Perhaps the goal was to build something that could continue without them. This reframes how power is understood. Power is not constant intervention. It is the ability to withdraw without collapse, to leave a system standing, to trust that what has been established will hold. By that measure, the gods do not fail. They succeed completely. Earth remains unchanged. Humans remain burdened. Authority remains intact. Memory remains active. The system endures. There is no need for return. Return would undo what has been achieved. It would reintroduce proximity, strain, fatigue. Distance preserves order. This is why the texts do not look forward to a future of renewed presence. They look forward to continuity. They focus on inheritance, not restoration. The world is not waiting. It is functioning. And that is perhaps the quietest and most unsettling implication of all. That the universe does not revolve around presence, divine or otherwise. It revolves around process. Those who cannot endure process step aside. Those who are born into it carry on. The Sumerian worldview does not condemn this reality. It records it. Without bitterness, without hope for reversal, with clarity. If even gods could not stay, then staying is not proof of greatness. Endurance is. And endurance does not require power. It requires adaptation, acceptance, and the willingness to live within limits that cannot be negotiated. Earth teaches this lesson patiently, without instruction, without warning. It teaches it to everyone equally. The gods learned it and adjusted. Humans live it daily. Nothing about this is meant to be comforting or frightening. It is meant to be understood. As the story finally grows quiet, there is nothing left to resolve. Only a recognition that presence fades, memory endures, and the world continues regardless. And in that recognition, there is a strange calm. Not because the world is gentle, but because it is honest. Nothing is promised. Nothing is spared. Everything that remains must adapt. The gods did. So did humanity. And Earth, unchanged, continues to turn beneath it all, indifferent to who once walked upon it, while carrying forward the weight of every story ever told about it. That is what it means, in the end, if even gods could not stay. And with that understanding, there is nothing left to add, only rest.